Somewhere in the world tonight, a person is sitting across a table from something that is not human, and they have no idea. The face looks right, the voice sounds right. In turn, the hands hold a cup the way your hands hold a cup. And underneath all of it, behind the eyes that blink at the correct speed and the mouth that smiles at the correct moments, there is something far older than the human race, wearing a person the way you would wear a coat that you took down off a hook. The Sumerians believed this. They did not believe it as a ghost story told to frighten children on a cold night. They believed it as a sober description of the world they were living in. Their scribes pressed the idea into wet clay more than 4,000 years ago, and that clay survived, baked hard by the same fires that burned their cities to the ground, buried under the mounds of southern Iraq for thousands of years, waiting for men with shovels to dig it back into the light. On those tablets, written in the oldest language we can still read, they left something that reads less like a myth and more like a warning. They wrote that the earth was not ours to begin with. They wrote that beings came down out of the sky and shaped us, ruled us, used our labor, and then, when the age of open rule came to an end, they did not go home. Beyond that, they put on our shape, and they stayed. To understand why that claim should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, you have to understand who the Sumerians were, because they were not primitives fumbling in the dark. They were the first. As far as the record of the human race goes, there is Sumer, and then there is everything that came after Sumer. They built the first cities that we would recognize as cities, walled places with tens of thousands of people packed inside them, in a flat and difficult land between two rivers where nothing about civilization was easy or obvious. They invented writing itself, the very technology you are using to receive these words right now. More than that, they invented the wheel, the plow that turned that land green, the 60-minute hour, and the 60-second minute that still rule the clock on your wall. They mapped the sky with a precision that took later astronomers thousands of years to match. They wrote law codes, love poems, tax records, and complaints about bad copper from dishonest merchants. These were serious people. These were the people who taught the human race how to keep records in the first place. And when these serious people, the founders of the whole project of civilization, sat down to explain where they had come from and who had taught them everything they knew, they did not point to a slow climb out of ignorance. They pointed at the sky. They said their knowledge had been handed to them, given, delivered by beings who were already here when the first men opened their eyes. The name they gave the greatest of these beings was the Anunnaki. The word itself is a door, and once you understand what is written on that door, you cannot unsee it. In the Sumerian tongue, the name breaks apart into pieces that the scribes themselves understood, and the most direct reading of those pieces is those who from heaven to earth came, not those who were born of the earth. Not those who rose up out of the soil of Mesopotamia like the reeds along the river, those who came down. The oldest people in the human story wrote, in the oldest words we have, that their gods were arrivals. That is the whole of it. That is the seed from which everything else in this account grows. For most of the modern age, scholars read that name and set it politely to one side. They called it religion, symbolism, the poetry of a young civilization reaching for the stars because it did not yet understand thunder or the movement of the planets. And that reading is comfortable, and it lets everyone sleep. But there has always been a second reading, older in spirit than the polite one, and it refuses to go away, no matter how many times it is buried. That second reading takes the Sumerians at their word. It asks a simple and dangerous question. What if they were not being poetic? What if they were writing down, as plainly as their language allowed, exactly what had happened to them? Take the story they told about how the human race was made, because it is unlike almost anything you were taught in a place of worship. In the Sumerian and later Babylonian accounts, preserved on tablets that sit today in museum drawers in London and Berlin and Baghdad, mankind was not created out of love. Mankind was created out of labor trouble. The tablets describe a time before people, when the lesser gods themselves were forced to do the back-breaking work of the world. They dug the channels that carried the rivers. They hauled the baskets of earth. By the same measure, they toiled without rest, and after long ages of it, they broke. They came in the night to the house of the chief of the gods, they set fire to their tools, and they surrounded his gate and refused to work another day. It is, when you strip away the divine names, a strike. It is the oldest labor uprising ever written down, and the strikers are gods. And the solution the gods reached for is the part that should stop you cold. Rather than crush the rebellion, the wisest among them, the god of the deep waters and of secret knowledge, proposed to manufacture a substitute. He proposed to make a new creature that would carry the yoke the gods no longer wished to carry. They would take the clay of the earth, and they would mix into it something of themselves, the flesh and the blood of a god, and from that mixture, they would fashion a being intelligent enough to follow orders, and strong enough to do the work. The mother goddess pinched off 14 pieces of that clay and shaped them, 7 and 7, and spoke the words over them, and the first humans were born already holding a basket and a spade. We were designed. We were built to a specification. Here too, we were, in the plainest language the tablets use, made to bear the toil of the gods so that the gods could rest. Now sit with the shape of that story for a moment, because the shape matters more than any single detail. A superior intelligence arrives from above. It finds a world it wants worked. It takes an existing raw material, the clay, which is to say the biology already present on this planet, and it edits that material by adding something of its own, and it produces a worker. That is not the story of a loving father breathing life into a garden. That is the story of a laboratory. It is the story an engineer would tell. And it was told, in that engineering shape, by the first engineers our species ever produced, thousands of years before anyone had a word for genetics or a way to imagine a chromosome. The people who take the Sumerians seriously look at that, and they say the obvious thing out loud. They say that if you strip the robe of myth off this account, what is left standing underneath looks disturbingly like a record of intervention, a record of our own making. And if that record is even partly true, then it forces a second question that is far more unsettling than the first, and it is the question this entire account exists to answer. If they made us, and if they ruled us in the open for a long age of kings and temples, then where did they go? The tablets have an answer for that too, and it is not the answer you would hope for. They did not say, the gods departed into the sky and left the earth to their creation. Read carefully. The record says something much stranger and much closer to home. It says the age of open rule ended. The great ones stepped back from their thrones and their ziggurats. The visible reign, the era when everyone knew the names of the ones who ruled from the high temples, that era closed like a door. But the beings themselves did not vanish. They changed how they moved through the world. They stopped ruling from the top of the tower where everyone could see them, and they began to move through the crowd, unseen, unnamed, wearing the very shape they had built for us. For that reason, they put on humanity like a disguise, and they walked down off the mountain and out among the people, and according to the oldest writing on earth, some of them are walking still. This is where the account stops being a history lesson about a dead civilization and becomes something that touches the chair you are sitting in tonight. Because the Sumerians did not describe one single kind of hidden being. They described many. Their world was crowded with entities that could take a human face, and they were careful, in the way that only frightened and precise people are careful, to tell them apart. They named them. They described how each one moved, what each one wanted, how each one could be recognized if you knew the signs, and, crucially, how long each one had been here. Some were recent arrivals, newcomers by the standards of these things, slipping into the human world for a single terrible purpose and slipping out again. Others had been here almost as long as we had, walking beside us since before the great flood their tablets so vividly describe. And a very few, had been here longer than the human race itself, present at the making, older than the first man, wearing our shape only because they were the ones who designed the shape in the first place. What follows is a ranking of 9 of them. 9 kinds of being the Sumerians and the peoples who inherited their tablets said were hiding in human form, ordered by the one measure that matters most when you are trying to understand a thing that pretends to be you, which is how long it has been doing the pretending. We will count from the most recent of them, the ones who came late and travel light, down through the ones woven into our bloodlines before recorded history, all the way down to the oldest, the first disguise, the one that was here before there was anyone for it to hide among. Some of these you may have heard of under other names in other traditions, wearing the masks that later religions gave them. Some of them you have almost certainly never heard named at all, because the men who wrote them down took care that they should be forgotten. And by the time we reach the last of them, the one that has been here the longest, you may find that you recognize it, and that recognition is the most frightening part of all. We begin with the newest of the 9, the ones who are, even now, the most recently arrived among us, the 9th being the most recent of them to walk among us, the Sumerians called the Galu. If you have never heard the name, that is by design, because the Galu were never meant to be famous. They were meant to be efficient. In the oldest tablets, they appear as a kind of officer, a functionary of the world below, and their entire purpose can be stated in a single sentence that has chilled every reader who has ever understood it. They come up from the underworld to take a specific person, and they do not leave without them. Everything else about the Galu, every strange detail the scribes recorded, flows from that one function. They are not tempters. They are not tricksters who play with your mind for the sport of it. In the same way, they are collectors, and the debt they collect is a life. The clearest picture we have of them comes from one of the most famous stories the ancient world ever told, a story so old that it was already ancient when the Babylonians recopied it, the account of the goddess Inanna and her descent into the land of the dead. Inanna, the queen of heaven, the most powerful goddess of the Sumerian world, decided to go down into the underworld ruled by her own sister and to pass through its 7 gates. At each gate she was stripped of one of her powers, one of her ornaments, one piece of her authority, until she stood naked and defenseless before the throne of the dead. And there she was struck down and hung on a hook like meat on a wall. It is a harrowing story. And the human part of it, the part about power and pride, and a woman walking willingly into a place she should have feared, is timeless. But that is not the part that concerns us. The part that concerns us is how she got back out. Because there is a law in the land of the dead, and the law is simple and terrible. No one leaves it without providing a substitute. No one climbs back up into the light without sending someone else down to take their place. And when Inanna was revived and permitted to return to the world of the living, she did not return alone. She was escorted. She was surrounded on her way up by a company of the Gallu, and the tablets describe these escorts with a care that reveals exactly how the Sumerians pictured them. They know no food, they know no drink. Even so, they eat no offering of flour, and they drink no libation of water poured out for them. They accept no gift, and they can be turned aside by no bribe. They take the wife from a man's embrace. What is more, they take the child from the knee of the nurse. They exist for one thing only, which is to seize the substitute that the law demands, and they will follow Inanna through the whole world until that substitute is found. Read that description again, and notice what is missing from it, because what is missing is the key to everything. There is nothing monstrous in it. The Gallu are not described as having wings, or fangs, or the heads of beasts. They are described entirely by their behavior and by what cannot move them. They cannot be fed. On top of this, they cannot be bought. They cannot be swayed by love or by pity or by the sight of a mother clutching her infant. In a world where every other spirit could be bargained with, fed, flattered, or bound by the right words, the Gallu were the ones you could do nothing about. And a being that looks like a man, that walks in the door like a man, that stands in your house like a man, but that has no hunger you can satisfy and no want you can meet, is far more frightening than any creature with claws. You cannot negotiate with something that needs nothing from you. You can only watch it take what it came for. This is the first and most important reason the Gallu belong at the top of any list of beings that hide in human form. They are, of all the entities the Sumerians described, among the most human in appearance and the least human in nature. The horror of them is not that they look like monsters. The horror is that they do not. They pass. They walk through the market and no one turns to look. Above all, they stand at the edge of a gathering and no one asks who invited them. And the person they have come for often does not know until it is far too late, because the thing about a collector is that it does not announce itself. It simply arrives and completes its errand and goes back down the way it came, and the world closes over the empty place where a person used to be. Consider what happened to Dumuzid, the shepherd, the young husband of Inanna, because his fate is the whole doctrine of the Gallu, written out as a single human tragedy. When Inanna returned to the surface with her company of collectors, she found that her husband had not mourned her. While she hung dead on the hook in the underworld, Dumuzid had seated himself upon her throne, dressed in fine garments, enjoying the power that her absence had handed him. And when she saw this, the queen, who had just clawed her way out of death, turned her cold and level gaze upon the man she loved, and she spoke a single word, and the word was a sentence: "Take him." The Gallu were already at her side. They had followed her up out of the pit for exactly this moment, waiting for her to name the substitute, and the moment she named him, they moved. What follows in the tablets is a chase, and the chase is one of the oldest depictions of pursuit in all of literature, and it reads like something out of a nightmare that people are still having today. Dumuzid ran. He prayed to the sun god to be turned into a snake, into a gazelle, into anything that could slip away, and each time he was transformed, and each time he escaped for a moment, and each time the Gallu found him again, because you cannot outrun a thing that is not bound by your speed or your cleverness. They tracked him across the land. They surrounded the sheepfold where he tried to hide among his own flock. And the description of them closing in is the description of a group of ordinary-looking figures moving with a patience and a certainty that is worse than any speed, because it tells you the outcome is already decided. They took him. He was dragged down into the land of the dead to hang in the place where his wife had hung, so that the ledger of the underworld could be balanced. A life for a life, exactly as the law required. The people who study the Sumerian material closely, And the people who take the ancient astronaut reading of it seriously look at the Gallu and they notice something that the polite scholarly reading tends to skate past. The Gallu are not really described as the dead, they are described as a separate order of being, a class of entity that lives in the world below but comes and goes into the world above with purpose and precision. They are functionaries of a system. For all that, they enforce a law. And a functionary who enforces a law of substitution, who arrives to collect a specific individual on behalf of a hidden authority, who cannot be bribed or reasoned with and who wears an ordinary shape while doing it, is not a ghost. A ghost is a leftover. A ghost has no errand. The Gallu have nothing but errands. They are sent. And the moment you understand that they are sent, you have to ask the question that the whole rest of this account is built around, which is sent by whom? Because the Gallu answer to the Queen of the Underworld, and the Queen of the Underworld is not some abstract force. She is Ereshkigal, sister of Inanna, one of the great ruling beings of the Sumerian cosmos, one of the very family of entities who came down from the sky at the beginning. The Gallu are her officers. They carry out her law. And that means that even the most recent and lowly of the beings on this list, the collectors who slip up into the world to take a marked life and slip back down again, are not free agents haunting the earth of their own accord. They are the reach of something higher. They are the hand at the end of a very long arm, and the arm goes back and back, up past the throne of the dead, into the ranks of the ones who ruled this world in the open before they learned to hide. The Gallu are the errand. The ones who send them are the mystery. And we will climb that arm, link by link, all the way to the shoulder, before this account is finished. But first, understand why these beings are the newest of the 9, the most recently arrived, and why that recency does not make them any less dangerous. The Gallu are not woven into the human bloodline. They did not intermarry with our ancestors. They did not settle among us and build dynasties and pass their nature down through the generations the way the older beings on this list did. In truth, they have no permanent residence in the human world at all. They are visitors in the purest and coldest sense. They come only when they are called, only when a specific errand requires them, and they stay only as long as the errand takes. And then they are gone, back down into the dark, until the next name is spoken. That is what makes them the 9th and most recent. Every other being we will meet has been here, continuously, embedded in the human story, for ages beyond counting. The Gallu are the ones who are still, to this day, arriving fresh, appearing and completing and vanishing, over and over, an endless series of new arrivals, wearing new faces, each one here for only a moment, each one indistinguishable from a stranger passing through town. And that endless newness is precisely why the folklore about them never died. Look at how many cultures, long after Sumer had crumbled into dust, kept telling stories about the same figure, the stranger who arrives in the village and asks for a particular person by name, the escort who comes to walk someone to a place they do not want to go. Time and again, the figure at the crossroads, who cannot be bargained with, who takes no payment, who is simply there to collect. The men in ordinary clothes who arrive quietly and lead someone away, and afterward no one can quite describe their faces. These stories are everywhere, in every land, told and retold across thousands of years, and the people who trace the ancestry of such tales find that the trail runs back, again and again, to the same source, to the flat land between the two rivers, to the tablets where the collectors were first described. The Gallu were the original. Everything that came after was an echo, and an echo that is still ringing 4,000 years later is not an echo of nothing. It is an echo of something the human race saw and named and never entirely stopped seeing. There is a detail in the incantation traditions of Mesopotamia, in the long series of spells the priests wrote to protect people from the beings that pressed in on the human world, that deserves to be lifted out and held up to the light. Among all the entities the exorcists learned to name and to ward off, the ones sent to seize a person were considered among the most difficult to turn aside, precisely because they were doing their assigned work. You could argue with a spirit that clung to a house out of malice or hunger, because malice and hunger have handles you can grip. You could offer it something. By the same token, you could bind it with the right formula. But a being that had been dispatched to collect a named individual was executing an order from above, and to turn it aside you had to reach past the collector to the one who had sent it, and provide the substitute the law demanded some other way. The whole grim machinery of substitution, the offering of one life to redeem another, the animal slaughtered so the person might be spared, so much of the ritual life of the ancient world, grows out of this single problem. How do you deal with a collector who cannot be dealt with? And the answer the ancients arrived at was always the same. You give it someone else. You provide the substitute. Past that point, you balance the ledger, because the ledger will be balanced one way or another, and the only question the Galu ever leave open is whose name goes in the empty place. The whole logic of substitution that the Galu enforce reached down into the ritual life of the ancient world in ways that still cast a shadow over us, because it is the root of one of the oldest and most persistent of all human practices, the offering of one life in place of another. When a person lay dying, when the collectors were understood to be near, the ancients did not simply grieve and wait. They acted. They performed rituals of substitution, offering something in the place of the marked person, a life for a life, in the hope that the collectors would take the substitute and leave the person. Often the substitute was an animal, slaughtered in the place of the human being, its life offered up to satisfy the demand of the underworld so that the human life might be spared. Sometimes the ritual used a figurine, a made image of the person, presented to the collectors as a decoy in the hope that they would seize the image and depart. The entire vast institution of sacrifice, the offering of life to the powers below and above, grows in part from this single terrible problem, the problem of the collector who cannot be turned aside except by giving it someone or something else. The ledger will be balanced. Just as clearly, the substitute must be found. And so the ancients built an entire apparatus of ritual around the desperate hope of persuading the collectors to accept a life other than the one they had come for. And the figure of the collector, the escort who comes to walk a person from the world of the living to the world of the dead, spread outward from Sumer into essentially every tradition the human race produced, becoming one of the most universal of all figures. There is, in culture after culture, the being whose office is to come for the dying and to conduct them to the next world, the guide of souls, the one who arrives at the threshold of death to lead the person across. Sometimes this figure is gentle, sometimes terrible, but its function is always the same, and its function is the function of the Galu, to come for a specific person at the appointed time and to conduct them away, and it is a figure that appears with such consistency across so many unconnected traditions that the students of these things have given it a single name, the conductor of souls, the one who leads the dead. And underneath all the later and gentler versions of this figure, the trail runs back to the collectors of Sumer, the officers of the underworld who climb up into the world of the living, who cannot be bribed or fed or turned aside, who know your name and come for you at the appointed time and never, in all the ages of writing, go home without the one they were sent to collect. So, when you walk out of your door tomorrow, and a stranger you have never seen falls into step beside you and asks, quietly, and with a certainty that does not match how little they should know, whether you are a certain person, remember what the oldest writing on earth said about the ninth kind of hidden being. Remember that they wear the plainest of faces. Remember that they carry no weapon and make no threat and want nothing you can give them. And remember that they never come for anyone by accident. The Galu are always sent. They always know the name. And they never, in all the ages that people have written about them, go home empty. They are the newest of the nine, arriving even now. And they are only the beginning of what was left behind when the great ones took off their crowns and put on our skin. For above the collectors, older than the errand runners of the dead, there is a being that does not wait to be sent. There is one that comes on its own, drawn to a single moment in the human life, the most fragile and defenseless moment there is, and it has been coming to that moment for far longer than the Galu have been running their errands. It comes wearing the face of help. It comes to the room where a mother is bringing a life into the world, and it comes smiling. The eighth being has been here longer than the collectors of the dead, and unlike them, she does not wait to be summoned. She comes on her own. She is drawn, always, to the same moment, the single most defenseless hour in the whole of a human life, the hour of birth, and she arrives at that hour wearing the one disguise that no frightened family thinks to question. Once again, she comes disguised as help. The Sumerians and the Babylonians who inherited their world knew her as Lamashtu, and of all the hidden beings they named, she may be the one the ancient world feared most personally, most intimately, and most constantly, because there was no household she could not enter, and no family she could not touch. To understand Lamashtu, you have to understand what birth meant in the ancient world, because we have forgotten, in our clean and well-lit age, how close to death the beginning of life used to sit. A birth was a doorway that swung both ways. A mother might walk through it and bring a child back into the light, or she might not walk back through it at all, and the child she carried might arrive already still, or might slip away in the first fragile nights before it ever learned to smile. These were not rare tragedies. They were the ordinary weather of human life, and every family lived under the shadow of them. And when a healthy child sickened for no reason anyone could see, when a strong mother's milk suddenly dried in her breast, when an infant that had been thriving was found cold and gray in the morning, With no mark on it and no illness to explain it, the people of Mesopotamia did not shrug and call it the cruelty of nature. They gave the cruelty a name and a face and a hunger. They said Lamashtu had been in the house. The tablets and the amulets describe her in language that leaves no doubt about how she was pictured, and the picture is deliberately, pointedly monstrous. In her true form, she has the head of a lioness. Her teeth are the teeth of a beast. Her fingers end in long nails and her hands in the talons of a bird of prey. She is often shown with the ears and sometimes the body of a donkey, standing upon a beast, suckling a piglet at one breast and a dog at the other, holding serpents in her raised hands. It is one of the most vivid and terrifying images the ancient world produced, and thousands of small clay and stone amulets bearing that image have survived, worn smooth by the hands of the frightened people who clutched them, because to own her image was, they believed, to have some power to turn her away. But here is the thing that the terrifying image conceals, and it is the reason she belongs on this list of beings that hide in human shape. That monstrous form is not the form in which she enters your house. That is the form the priest drew so that people would know what was truly standing in the room. The form she wears when she actually comes is far gentler and far worse, because Lamashtu, the tablets tell us, comes to the birthing room in the guise of a helping woman. She appears as a nurse, as a midwife, as a kindly neighbor, as exactly the sort of person a laboring mother would be desperate to welcome. She offers to hold the child so the exhausted mother can rest. In turn, she offers her own breast to feed the infant when the mother is too weak. She slips into the crowded, anxious, frightened room where a family is at its most vulnerable, and she is welcomed, because in that moment help of any kind feels like mercy, and no one looks too closely at the face of mercy. And it is when she is holding the child, when the mother has finally closed her eyes, trusting that the baby is safe in another woman's arms, that Lamashtu does what she came to do. She touches the infant 7 times. She lays her hand upon it. And the life that was in the child begins, quietly and without violence, to go out. The Sumerian and Babylonian incantations against her are among the most detailed protective texts to survive from the ancient world, and they read like the desperate, methodical work of people who had lost too many children and were determined to fight back with the only weapons they had, which were words and images and ritual. The incantations name her. They recite her genealogy, because to know a being's true name and lineage was to have leverage over it. And what they say about her lineage is the first great clue to why she is on this list and how she connects to everything else in this account. Lamashtu, the incantations declare, is the daughter of Anu. She is the daughter of the Sky Father himself, the highest of the high gods, the one whose very name means heaven. She was born among the great beings who came down at the beginning, and she was cast out. Beyond that, she was expelled from the company of the gods for her cruelty, thrown down from the heights to the earth, and she has wandered the human world ever since, carrying her grudge and her hunger from house to house, generation after generation, for as long as there have been mothers to prey upon. Hold that detail up and turn it over, because it changes the whole meaning of what she is. Lamashtu is not a random monster that crawled up out of a swamp. She is not a spirit of disease with no history. She is a fallen member of the ruling family. More than that, she is one of the beings who came from heaven to earth, an Anunnaki by blood, the daughter of the very highest of them, who was thrown down among us and now hides among us, wearing the shape of an ordinary woman, doing terrible work in the shadows of our most private moments. She is, in the most literal sense the tablets allow, one of them living secretly among us. And the fact that the highest gods themselves cast her out, that even her own kind found her intolerable and expelled her, tells you something about the scale of what we are dealing with. If the beings who ruled this world drew a line and put Lamashtu on the wrong side of it, then whatever she does when she holds a sleeping child in a darkened room is something that even gods considered a crime. The people who read these tablets through the ancient astronaut lens make an argument here that is difficult to dismiss once you have heard it. They point out that Lamashtu's methods, stripped of the mythic language, describe something with unsettling precision. She dries up a nursing mother's milk. She causes a thriving infant to weaken and die in the night without visible cause. By the same measure, she brings on miscarriage and stillbirth. She spreads what the texts describe as a wasting fever. In other words, she is associated, again and again, with exactly the cluster of reproductive and infant catastrophes that a modern person would recognize as the signatures of infection, of contamination, of biological interference with the most delicate machinery of human reproduction. And so the question the ancient astronaut readers ask is a pointed one. What if the ancients were describing, in the only language they had, a being that understood human biology well enough to disrupt it, a being that could reach into the process of birth and turn it against itself. A being that did not need claws or teeth to kill a child, but only the knowledge of where the fragile thresholds were and the will to cross them. That is not the profile of a demon out of a fairy tale. That is the profile of something with a surgeon's understanding of a body it did not design out of love. And notice the specificity of her hunt, because the specificity is itself a kind of evidence. Lamashtu does not attack indiscriminately. She does not bring down the strong warrior or the powerful king. She comes for the newborn and the mother in childbed, which is to say she comes for the point in the human life cycle where the next generation is being made and is at its most breakable. Here too, she attacks the future. She attacks continuity. She attacks the single link in the chain of human life where the chain is thinnest and easiest to break, the handoff from one generation to the next. If you wanted to design a being whose purpose was to thin the human population quietly, to keep its numbers in check without ever being seen to do so, without ever provoking the mass terror that an open slaughter would provoke, you could hardly design one better than a thing that comes as a helper to the birthing room and lays its hand upon the child while the mother sleeps. The people who take the darkest view of these tablets say exactly that. They say Lamashtu reads less like a random evil and more like a function. A cull. A quiet, ancient, ongoing management of the human herd, carried out in the one room where no one would ever think to look for a predator, by a being that even the gods threw away. The amulets tell us how the ancient world fought back, and the fight itself reveals how seriously they took the threat. To guard a birthing room, a family would hang a plaque bearing the image of another being entirely, a fierce winged figure with the face of a snarling beast, the king of the wind demons, whose name was Pazuzu. This is one of the strangest arrangements in all of ancient belief, and it is worth pausing on. To protect a mother and child from Lamashtu, the Mesopotamians did not summon a gentle guardian angel. They summoned a monster to fight a monster. They set a terrible thing at the door to keep out a worse thing. The logic was that Pazuzu, dreadful as he was Lamashtu's enemy, and that his image, glaring out from the wall of the room, would drive her back down into the underworld she came from. Small bronze heads of Pazuzu, some with a loop so they could be worn, have been found across the ancient Near East, and many of them were almost certainly made for exactly this purpose, to stand watch over the vulnerable and turn the false helper away from the door. When your defense against one hidden being is to enlist a second hidden being, you are living in a world far more crowded and far more dangerous than the empty, mechanical universe we tell ourselves we live in now. But amulets and images were not the whole of the defense, because the ancients understood that Lamashtu's great weapon was her disguise, and the counter to a disguise is recognition. Much of the incantation literature is devoted to naming her, to reciting exactly who she was and where she came from and what she looked like underneath the borrowed face, because to say aloud what she truly was, in the presence of the family and the child, was to strip the mask away. The priest who could name the lioness-headed daughter of the sky, who could describe her talons and her true parentage in front of the whole household, was performing an act of exposure. He was announcing to the room that the kindly woman by the cradle was not what she appeared to be. And, in a world where these beings depended entirely on passing unnoticed, on being welcomed as help, the act of correctly naming them was the sharpest weapon a human being possessed. This is a theme we will return to again and again as we climb this list, because it is the one advantage we have ever had over the things that hide in our shape. They can wear our faces, they can walk in our doors, but if you know the signs, if you know the true name and the true nature underneath the borrowed skin, you can see them for what they are, and a being that has been seen has lost half its power. Consider the sheer volume of the defense that grew up around her, because the scale of the countermeasures is itself a measurement of the size of the fear. Lamashtu is one of the most frequently attested beings in the whole of Mesopotamian magic, and the objects made to fight her number in the many hundreds. There were the plaques, small slabs of stone or clay carved with her image on one side and lines of incantation on the other, hung in the birthing room or laid beneath the mother's bed. There were the amulets worn on cords around the neck of the pregnant woman and, once the child was born, around the neck of the infant. For that reason, there were the ritual bowls and the figurines, the clay models of her that were made specifically so that they could be sent away, floated down the river, or buried at the edge of the settlement, carrying her image and, the ritual hoped, her presence out of the house and away from the child. An entire craft economy of protection revolved around this one being, generation after generation of frightened parents commissioning her image so that they could drive it away. And the persistence of that craft across the centuries tells you that the fear never faded, that in every generation, there were mothers who woke to find a thriving child gone cold. And who knew, with the certainty of a whole culture behind them, exactly what had come in the night and laid its hand upon their baby? And the incantations against her preserve, in their long recitations of her nature, a detail that connects her to the deepest layers of this whole account, because they describe not only what she does, but the peculiar way she comes and goes. She slips in, the texts say, through the pivot of the door, through the socket where the door turns, through any gap or seam in the house, entering not by breaking in, but by passing through the small overlooked openings that no one thinks to guard. She is a thing of thresholds and gaps and the unwatched seams of the ordinary house, and once inside she makes for the one room that matters, drawn to the newborn as surely as heat rises. The ancients pictured her entry with such specificity, through the door pivot, through the window, through the crack in the wall, that they were plainly describing something they believed moved in a particular way, a being with a method, not a vague spirit of misfortune, but a specific intruder with a specific route and a specific target. Her shadow fell across every culture that came after Mesopotamia, and the shape of her can be traced in the child-stealing, night-haunting female figures that appear in tradition after tradition. The beautiful or monstrous woman who preys on the newborn, and the mother in childbed. The demon of the nursery who must be warded off with charms and names and the hanging of protective images above the cradle. The specific details migrate and change, but the core figure remains recognizable across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The female being who comes for the very young, who must be kept out by knowing her name and displaying the signs that repel her, and the trail of that figure, followed back through the layers of tradition, keeps arriving at the same lioness-headed daughter of the sky, cast down among us, hunting at the cradle from inside the borrowed shape of a helping woman. So the eighth of the nine is a fallen daughter of heaven, cast down among us, hunting the beginning of human life from inside the disguise of a helping hand. She has been here far longer than the collectors of the dead, because she was thrown down in the age of the gods themselves, and she has never left, and she has never stopped. She does not come for the errand of another. In the same way, she comes for herself, for her own hunger, drawn to the cradle and the childbed by something older than record. And the reason she stands only at number 8, rather than higher on this list, is that for all her antiquity she is still a solitary thing, a single expelled being working alone in the dark. The beings above her are not alone. They come in numbers. They come as seduction, and as multitude, and as bloodline, and the higher we climb, the less these entities look like intruders, slipping into the human world, and the more they look like something that has been woven into the human world from the very fabric of the beginning. For the next of them does not come for the newborn. It comes for the grown man and the grown woman, in the dark, in the bed, in the hour when desire silences every warning the mind might otherwise give. It comes wearing the most dangerous disguise of all, the face of the one you most want to see, and it has been coming to human beings, night after night, since long before anyone thought to write it down. The seventh being does not come for the child. It comes for the grown man and the grown woman, and it comes in the one place where every human being is defenseless, no matter how strong or how wary they are, which is the dark of their own bedroom. In the deep of the night, in the hour of sleep, the Sumerians called these beings the Lilu and the Lilitu, and the female of them, the one whose memory outlived all the rest, and traveled down through 3,000 years of story to become a name that people still whisper, would one day be known as Lilith. But long before that name was famous, the tablets of Mesopotamia described a class of night beings whose method of hiding among us is the most intimate and the most dangerous of any we have yet seen. They do not wear the face of a helper. They wear the face of the one you most desire. The word itself carries a clue to their nature, and it is a clue that the scribes understood. The name is bound up with the wind, with the night wind in particular, the wind that moves through the empty places after dark when everyone else has gone inside. These were beings of the air, and the night, and the desolate margins of the settled world, associated in the oldest texts with the wilderness, with ruined places, with the abandoned house, and the empty field where no one lives, the forsaken ground where a traveler would not want to be caught after sundown. They were creatures of the threshold, of the border between the inhabited and the wild, between the waking and the sleeping, between the world you can see and the world that presses against it in the dark. And their point of entry into human life was the most defenseless threshold of all, the moment when a person lies down, closes their eyes, and surrenders the guard that the waking mind keeps posted all day long. For the ancients understood something about sleep that we have largely forgotten to fear. When you sleep, you are not present in the way you are when you are awake. Your judgment is gone. Your will is loosened. The part of you that would notice a wrongness, that would ask a question, that would recoil from a stranger is switched off. And into that undefended dark, the tablets say, the Lilitu comes. She comes to the man who sleeps alone, and she takes the form of a woman of surpassing beauty, and she lies with him. And in the morning he does not know whether he dreamed her or whether she was real, because the entire encounter took place in the borderland where he could not tell the difference. And the male of the kind, the Lilu, does the same to sleeping women. These beings were, in the most direct sense, night visitors who came in the shape of the perfect lover, took what they came for, and were gone before the sleeper fully woke. There is a third figure in this family that the tablets name, and she is in some ways the most poignant and the most revealing, because her story explains the hunger that drives all of them. She is the Ardat Lily, which is often understood as the maiden who never became a bride. She is the young woman who died, or who was cursed, before she could know the ordinary human fulfillment of marriage and children and a household of her own. Even so, she was cheated of the natural human life, and so she haunts the edges of that life she was denied, coming to sleeping men in a desperate, endless, hollow imitation of the wedding night she never had. There is a terrible sadness threaded through this, and the ancients felt it. These were not simply predators. They were, in the mythic logic of the tablets, beings full of an unquenchable longing for a human completeness that was forever out of their reach, and their nighttime visits were the shape that longing took, a grasping after something they could touch but never truly possess. That combination of desire and emptiness, of a hunger for human life pursued through the imitation of human love, is exactly what makes them so dangerous, because a being that wants what you have and can never have it is a being that will keep coming back, night after night, for as long as you sleep. And what did the sleeper lose in these encounters? The tablets and the later traditions are consistent on this point, and it is the point that matters most for understanding what these beings truly were. The person visited by a Lilitu did not simply have a pleasant dream. They woke weakened. They woke drained, diminished, as though something had been taken out of them in the night. Over time, a man haunted by such a being was said to waste away, to lose his strength and his vitality, and his interest in the living women around him, to grow pale and hollow and turned inward, pining after a phantom that visited only in the dark and left him emptier each time. The Lilitu fed. Whatever it was that they took from a sleeping human being, and the traditions describe it as something like the life force itself, the vital essence, the seed of life in the most literal and the most figurative sense, it left the human less than they had been. And a being that comes to you in the shape of your deepest desire, in the undefended dark, and leaves you weakened every time it comes, is a being that has found the perfect way to feed on a human being without ever having to overpower one. It does not need to be stronger than you. It only needs to wait until you are asleep, and then to become the one thing you would never turn away. The people who read these tablets through the ancient astronaut lens find in the Lilitu something that resonates uncomfortably with a very modern set of reports, and once the parallel is pointed out, it is hard to unhear. Consider the pattern. A being that comes in the night, when the person is in bed and cannot move and cannot fully wake. A being that is associated with a paralysis of the will, an inability to resist. What is more, a being that is interested, above all else, in the reproductive essence of the human being, in the seed of life, in the machinery of human generation. A being that takes something from the body in the dark and leaves the person with only a hazy, dreamlike, half-remembered impression of what happened, unsure whether it was real. The readers who take the darkest and strangest view of these tablets ask the obvious question. Why does the oldest description of a night visitor in human history match, point for point, the structure of the encounters that people in our own time report and cannot explain? Why did the Sumerians, 4,000 years ago, already know about the paralyzed sleeper, the irresistible presence, the interest in human reproduction, and the fogged and dreamlike memory afterward? Either the human mind produces the same nightmare in every age for reasons of its own, or the same thing has been visiting sleeping human beings, in the same way, for the same purpose, since long before anyone had the words to describe it. The tablets do not decide the question for us. They only make it impossible to pretend the question is new. And the reach of these beings across the whole of human culture is staggering, which is itself a kind of evidence for how deep and how old they run. Because the Lilitu did not stay buried in the clay of Mesopotamia. She walked out of Sumer and into every tradition that came after. She appears, by name, a single time in the Hebrew scriptures, in a passage describing the desolation of a ruined land, listed among the wild creatures that will haunt the wasteland after judgment has fallen upon it, the night creature that will settle in the abandoned place and find rest there. That single ancient mention was the seed from which an enormous later tradition grew, the tradition that made Lilith the first woman, the one who came before Eve, the one who refused to submit and fled the garden and became the mother of demons and the queen of the night, the being who returns in the dark to threaten newborns and to visit sleeping men. And beyond the traditions that used her name, the same figure appears under 100 other names in 100 other lands. The beautiful woman by the water who lures men to their deaths. The night hag who sits upon the sleeper's chest and steals his breath. On top of this, the demon lover who comes in the dark and drains the life from those who welcome her. The male spirit who visits women in their sleep and fathers strange children. Every culture that ever kept records seems to have known this being, described this being, feared this being, and warned against this being. And the trail of that fear, followed back far enough, again and again, arrives at the same flat land between the two rivers, at the same tablets, at the same night wind blowing through the same ruined places, at the Lilu and the Lilitu, who were there at the start. Notice too what kind of disguise this is, because it is subtler and more terrible than any we have yet examined. Lamashtu wore the disguise of a helper, and a helper is at least a stranger you have chosen to trust. But the Lilitu wears the disguise of desire itself. It becomes the shape of what the sleeper most wants, and there is no defense against that, because the want comes from inside the human being, not from outside. The Lilitu does not have to fool your judgment with a clever costume. It reaches past your judgment entirely, into the deep and wordless part of you, where longing lives, and it puts on the shape it finds there. It becomes your own desire made flesh in the dark. And how do you refuse your own desire? How do you set a guard against the thing you most wish were true? This is why the ancients considered the Lilitu among the hardest of all beings to protect against, harder in some ways than the collectors of the dead, because the collectors at least came for a stranger you could name, while the Lilitu came wearing the face you had built for yourself out of your own hidden heart. To be visited by it was, in a sense, to be betrayed by your own longing, and there is no amulet strong enough to guard a man against himself. The exorcists and the priests fought these beings the only way anyone ever fought the hidden things, by naming them, by knowing them, by teaching people to recognize the pattern of the night visitor, and to understand that the perfect lover who comes only in the dark and leaves them weaker every dawn was not a blessing, but a predator. The incantation traditions of Mesopotamia contain spells specifically against the Lilu and the Lilitu and the Ardat Lili, spells to drive them back to the wilderness and the ruined places where they belonged, spells to close the bedroom against the night wind and its hungers. And running through all of those spells is the same hard-won human wisdom that we keep encountering as we climb this list. The thing that hides in human shape depends on not being recognized. It survives by passing, by being welcomed, by being mistaken for something you want in your house. And the moment a human being learns to see the pattern, to know the signs, to name the visitor for what it truly is, the spell of the disguise begins to break. Recognition has always been our one weapon, and against the being that wears the mask of our own desire, recognition is a weapon that costs a great deal to wield, because to use it you must first admit that the thing you wanted was never really there. There is a further dimension to these beings that the oldest texts insist upon, and it deepens both their sorrow and their menace, which is that they were understood to move in a family, a triad, three related forms of the same night hunger. There was the male, the Lilu, who came to sleeping women. Above all, there was the female, the Lilitu, who came to sleeping men. And there was the third, the Ardat Lili, the restless maiden who never became a bride. And the three of them together formed a single class of being, the night visitors of the wind and the wilderness, bound by the same nature and the same unquenchable longing for the human life that was always just beyond their reach. The ancients did not treat these as separate creatures so much as three faces of one condition, the condition of a being that hungers for human intimacy and human continuity, for the marriage bed and the child in the household, and that can only ever imitate these things in the dark, taking but never truly possessing, feeding but never truly filling the emptiness that drives it. The whole family of them shares that hollow at the center, and the hollow is what makes them relentless, because a hunger that can never be satisfied is a hunger that never stops. And when you trace where these beings went after Mesopotamia fell, the trail is one of the widest and best documented in all of the study of old belief, because the night visitor who comes in the shape of desire is a figure that essentially every human culture recorded and feared. In the traditions of the medieval world, there were the beings that came to sleepers in the night to lie with them and drain them, the male form and the female form, named and catalogued and warned against in the manuals of the learned, and these were understood by many of the scholars who wrote about them to be old beings under new names, the same night hungers that had troubled sleepers since the beginning. In the folk traditions of countless peoples there is the night hag, The presence that comes when you are lying in bed on the border of sleep, that sits upon you, that holds you down so that you cannot move or cry out, that presses the breath from you while you lie paralyzed and aware. The experience is described with an almost identical set of features across cultures that never spoke to one another. The paralysis, the crushing presence, the inability to move or wake, the sense of a figure in the room, and in culture after culture that figure is named and feared and warded against. And in culture after culture it is associated with the same cluster of dangers the Mesopotamians associated with the Lilitu, the draining of vitality, the interest in the sleeper's body, the visitation that leaves the person weakened and unsettled. Whatever the true source of that experience, the human race has been having it, and naming it, and building defenses against it, for as long as we have records, and the oldest name we have for it comes from the flat land between the two rivers, from the beings of the night wind who were there at the start. So, the seventh of the nine is a being of the night wind, older than the fallen daughter of heaven who preys on the cradle, a haunter of thresholds, who comes to the sleeper in the shape of desire, and feeds on the vital essence of human life, while leaving behind only a fogged and dreamlike memory. It has been visiting human beings since before the first tablet was pressed, and it visits them still, under 1,000 names, in every land where people close their eyes at night and become, for a few undefended hours, unable to tell the difference between what they long for and what has come in the dark to feed. These beings come in ones and twos, singular hungers in the singular dark of a single sleeper. But the beings above them do not come alone, and they do not come in the shape of desire. They come as a company, as a fixed and terrible number, and when they appear together in the world of men, they appear as an omen, and what they are an omen of is the end of a city. The sixth being is not one being at all. It is seven, and it always was seven. And the fact that it is always exactly seven is the first thing you need to understand about it, because in the mind of the ancient world, the number seven was not chosen at random and it was not a decoration, it was a dread. The Sumerians and the Babylonians called this company the Sabiti, which means simply the seven, and they were among the most feared entities in the entire cosmos of Mesopotamia, because unlike the solitary hungers we have met so far, unlike the single collector, or the lone fallen daughter, or the night visitor at one sleeper's bed, the seven moved together, acted together, and arrived together. And when they arrived together in the world of men, they did not come for one person. They came for a city. To feel the weight the ancients placed on these beings, you have to sit with one of the oldest and most spine-chilling refrains ever set down in writing. In the great Mesopotamian incantation series against the evil ones, the series the priests recited to drive back the beings that pressed upon the human world, there is a passage that repeats the number over and over, hammering it into the listener like a nail. They are seven. They are seven. In the depths of the deep waters, they are seven. In the heights of the heavens, they are seven. They were born in the mountain of the sunset. They grew up in the mountain of the sunrise. And on it goes, this drumbeat of 777, describing beings that are neither male nor female, that take no wife and father, no children, that know no mercy and heed no prayer, that sweep across the land like a storm and stand in the doorway of the house and cannot be turned away by any offering. It is one of the most genuinely frightening pieces of writing to survive from the ancient world, precisely because of its relentlessness. And the thing it describes with such relentlessness is a group of exactly seven beings that move as one and destroy without pity. But the seven are not only the evil ones of the incantations. In the highest and most terrible of their appearances, they are the Sabiti of the great epic of destruction, the poem the Babylonians told about the god of plague and war and the burning of cities, the god Era, who is another face of the underworld Lord Nergal. And in that poem, the seven are given a genealogy that places them at the very heart of everything this account is about. They are the sons of Anu. They are the offspring of the Sky Father himself, the highest of the high, the same source from which the fallen daughter Lamashtu came, born among the great beings at the beginning of things. And Anu, the poem says, gave these seven sons a purpose and a nature, and he assigned to each of them a destiny of destruction. He made them as weapons. He made them to be unleashed when the world grew too full, too loud, too crowded with human beings. And he set them aside like arrows in a quiver, waiting for the hand that would draw them out. The story the epic tells is one that should stop the breath of anyone who takes these tablets seriously, because it is, in the plainest terms, the story of a deliberate decision by a god to depopulate the human world, and of the seven beings who were the instrument of that decision. The god Era grows restless. He has been idle too long, and the poem describes him in a state that is almost like a sickness, a growing agitation, a hunger for the violence that is his nature. And the seven, his weapons, do not soothe this restlessness. They feed it. They come to him and they goad him. For all that, they tell him that his weapons have grown dull from lack of use, that the people of the land have grown too numerous and too noisy, that the clamor of humanity has become unbearable, that it is time, past time, for the god to rouse himself and go down into the world of men and do what he was made to do. And notice the specific complaint the seven bring, because it is a complaint we have heard before in these tablets and will hear again. The people have become too many. Their noise disturbs the peace of the gods. There are simply too many human beings, and something must be done to thin them. This is one of the oldest and most persistent themes in all of Mesopotamian literature, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Again and again, in tablet after tablet, the trouble begins with the same thing. Humanity multiplies. The human race, made to serve, made to do the labor of the gods, does what living things do, and it grows, and it spreads, and it fills the land, and its numbers and its noise rise up to the heavens and disturb the ones who made it. And again, the response of the great beings is not to rejoice in the flourishing of their creation. It is to reach for a means of reducing it. In one famous account, it is a plague. In another, it is a drought and a famine. The most famous of all is a great flood sent deliberately to wipe the human race from the earth. And here, in the Epic of Era, it is the seven, drawn out of the quiver at last, sent down into the cities of men to burn and to slaughter and to bring the numbers back down to a level the gods can tolerate. The Sabidi are the arrows of that ancient and recurring impulse to cull the human herd, and when they are loosed, a city dies. Now, here is where the seven earn their place on this particular list, among the beings that hide in human shape, because the manner of their coming is the quietest and most insidious part of the whole terrible business. The seven do not descend from the sky in a blaze of fire that everyone can see. They do not announce themselves with trumpets. In the incantation traditions, they slip into the world. They move unseen through the streets. They pass over the walls of the city, not as an army, but as a presence, a wrongness in the air, a company of figures that are somehow there among the crowd, without anyone quite being able to say when they arrived or who they are. Time and again, they stand in the doorway. They walk in the market. They are among the people, indistinguishable from the people, and it is only afterward, when the plague has begun to spread, or the madness has begun to take hold, or the violence has begun to break out for no reason anyone can name, that the wise understand the seven have come. By the same token, they are the strangers no one remembers inviting. They are the seven faces in the crowd that no one can place, and by the time you recognize them, the city is already dying, because their work is not to fight you in the open. Their work is to be present, quietly, in the middle of your ordinary life, and to let the destruction they carry unfold from the inside. The people who read these tablets through the ancient astronaut lens find the Sabidi especially disturbing, and for a specific reason. It is not the violence that unsettles them, because violence is common in old myths. It is the coldness of the mechanism. The seven are described over and over as instruments. They are weapons that were manufactured for a purpose and stored until needed. They have no wives, no children, no lives of their own, no desires beyond the destruction they were made to carry out. Past that point, they are, in the most literal reading the tablets allow, a purpose-built strike force, created by the highest of the sky beings, assigned a specific mission of population reduction, and deployed into the human world in a form that lets them move unseen among their targets until the moment of activation. Strip away the mythic robes, the ancient astronaut readers say, and what is left is the description of something that does not belong in a fairy tale at all. It belongs in a much colder kind of document, a being that was designed as a weapon, held in reserve, and released to reduce a population that its makers had judged to be too large, is not a demon. It is a tool. And the fact that the oldest civilization on Earth described its gods as keeping exactly such tools in reserve and unleashing them on humanity again and again whenever the human numbers rose too high is one of the most quietly horrifying things in the entire record. And once more, the reach of the seven across the whole of human memory is a thing that demands explanation. The number seven, as a number of dread and of hidden power, went everywhere the human story went. 7 evil spirits, 7 plagues, just as clearly, 7 seals that hold back a coming destruction, 7 beings who march before the end. The 7 stars that the ancients watched in the sky and wove into 100 myths of pursuit and danger. Wherever you look in the traditions of the ancient world, the number 7 recurs at the moments of greatest fear and greatest transformation, at the thresholds where a world ends and another begins. And the ancient astronaut readers argue that this is not a coincidence of human psychology but a memory, a scar left on the collective mind of the species by an encounter with a company of 7 that was real, that came, that did what it was made to do, and that left behind a dread of the number that is never fully healed. When a symbol is that persistent, that widespread, that tied to catastrophe across so many separate cultures, the readers who take the tablet seriously say you have to at least consider that the symbol is pointing at something that happened, rather than at nothing at all. There is a further detail worth lifting out, because it deepens the horror rather than relieving it. The Sabiti were not always described as purely evil. In some traditions, there were 7 who were good and 7 who were terrible, 7 who protected and 7 who destroyed, and the same iconography of 7 figures could appear as guardians standing watch as easily as invaders bringing ruin. And this doubleness, this sense that the 7 could be turned either way, that they were a power that could guard a threshold or breach it depending on whose hand held them, is exactly the profile of a weapon. A weapon is not good or evil in itself. It is loyal to the hand that wields it. And the fact that the ancients pictured their 7 as capable of both protection and annihilation, as a force that stood guard for their makers and slaughtered their makers' enemies, tells you once again that these were not wild spirits acting on their own hungers. They were assets. They belonged to someone. Once again, they did what they were told. And when they were told to come down into a city of human beings and reduce its numbers, they came, quietly, unseen, 7 faces in the crowd, and they did it. The epic that preserves them most fully deserves a closer look, because the way it describes their creation is the coldest and most deliberate account of manufactured beings in the whole of ancient literature. The Sky Father, it says, did not simply father the 7 in the ordinary way. He assigned to each of them a specific and terrible destiny at the moment of their making, a purpose built into each one like a function built into a tool. To the first, he gave a nature that would strike down whatever it faced. To the second, he gave the power to burn like fire and consume. In turn, to the third he gave the face of a lion, so that whoever looked upon it would lose heart and collapse. And so on through all 7, each one endowed at its creation with a particular mode of destruction, each one a different instrument in a set, the whole company designed as a complete toolkit for the reduction of a population. They were not born and then trained. They were made to specification, each with its destructive purpose already installed, and then they were set aside, held in reserve, kept in the quiver against the day they would be needed. That is not the language of myth describing wild spirits. That is the language of a maker describing a set of weapons, each engineered for a specific effect, and it was written down by the oldest civilization on Earth, as a straightforward account of where these beings came from and what they were for. And the poem is unflinching about the outcome when they are finally loosed, because it describes the destruction they bring, not as a battle, but as a collapse from within. When the god of plague finally rouses himself and goes down into the cities of men with the 7 at his side, what follows is not an invading army at the gates, but a society coming apart from the inside, order dissolving, the just and the unjust destroyed together, the fabric of the human world unraveling as the 7 move unseen through it. The poem describes a world turned against itself, neighbor against neighbor, the structures of ordinary life breaking down, and it presents all of this as the work of the 7, the effect of their presence in the midst of the population, the unraveling that spreads outward from them like rot from a hidden core. It is a portrait of a civilization destroying itself, and the ancient understanding was that this self-destruction was not spontaneous but seeded, that the madness and the violence and the collapse were introduced into the human world by beings who had been sent for exactly that purpose and who worked from within, invisibly, until the society they had entered tore itself apart. The dread of the number they embody outlasted every empire that ever feared them, and it went everywhere the human story went, attaching itself to the moments of greatest catastrophe and greatest transformation in tradition after tradition. 7 spirits of affliction, 7 vials of wrath. Beyond that, 7 trumpets announcing the end, 7 seals holding back a coming ruin. Wherever a tradition reached for a number to mark the threshold of destruction, the number it reached for, again and again, was 7, and the ancient astronaut readers argue that this is the fossil of a real encounter, the scar left on the collective memory of the species by the 7 who came and did their work, and left behind a dread of their number that has never fully healed. So the 6th of the 9 is a company of 7 sons of the Sky Father, manufactured as weapons and held in reserve, who slip unseen into the cities of men when the human race has grown too numerous for the comfort of the ones above, and who bring plague and madness and slaughter from the inside, wearing no face at all that anyone can afterward remember. They have been here since the beginning, waiting in the quiver, drawn out again and again across the ages, whenever the ancient impulse to thin the human herd stirred once more, And the dread of them is written into the human mind so deeply that we still count catastrophe in sevens without knowing why. These beings serve. They are instruments of a higher will, arrows fired by a hand we have not yet named. But the beings above them on this list are no longer instruments. They are no longer weapons that someone else holds. As we climb higher, we begin to reach the ones who do the holding, the ones who intermarried with our ancestors and put their own blood into the human line, the ones who did not merely visit the human world but settled in it, and whose descendants, according to the oldest writing on earth, may be walking among us still, carrying the blood of heaven in ordinary human veins. The fifth being was here before the human race existed, and that single fact lifts it into a different order of antiquity than anything we have met so far. The collectors, the fallen daughter, the night visitors, the company of seven, all of them came into a world that already had people in it. They are old, some of them very old, but they entered a human world. The fifth being did not enter a human world. It was already here when there was no human world at all, laboring under the open sky of a young earth. And it was there, in fact, at the very moment our species was designed, because our species was designed to take its place. The Sumerians called these beings the Igigi, and to understand why they belong not among the intruders but among our own ancestors, you have to go back to the beginning of the story, before the first man, to the age when the only ones on this earth were the beings who came from the sky, and the ones above them made them work. The oldest tablets describe a time that is almost impossible for a modern mind to hold, because it is a time before us, and we are not used to imagining a world that did not include ourselves. In that time, the great tablets say, there were the higher gods and there were the lower gods, and the lower gods, the working class of heaven, were made to do the labor of the earth. And the tablet that preserves this most fully, one of the great Babylonian accounts of the origin of mankind, describes their toil in language that is startlingly physical and startlingly grim. They dug out the channels of the rivers. They dredged the canals that carried the water across the flat land. More than that, they hauled the baskets of excavated earth, piling them up until the mountains of dug soil rose around them. They did this labor not for a year or for a lifetime, but for what the tablet counts as thousands of years. Generation upon generation of them bent to the same endless work, and the weight of it crushed them, and finally it broke them. And the beings that broke under this labor, the working gods who dug the rivers of the world with their own hands until they could bear it no longer, these were the Igigi. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary passages in all of ancient literature, and it has been read 1,000 times by people who did not realize what they were reading. The Igigi rebelled. After ages of toil, in the middle of the night, they took the tools of their labor, the picks and the baskets and the digging spades, and they set them on fire. They burned their own equipment, and then they marched, the whole exhausted mass of them, to the great gate of the house of the god who commanded them, the Lord of the earth and the air, and they surrounded it, and they raised a cry against him in the dark, and they refused to lift another basket of earth ever again. It is, and there is no other honest way to describe it, a labor strike. It is the oldest account of a workforce laying down its tools and rising against its masters that exists anywhere in the human record, and the workforce is a population of beings from the sky, and the thing they are striking against is the endless toil of building and maintaining the physical infrastructure of a world. And the response of the high gods to this uprising is the hinge on which the entire human story turns. They did not crush the Igigi. They did not destroy the rebels and replace them with a fresh generation of the same. Instead, the wisest among the great gods, the master of the deep waters and of clever solutions, proposed something new. He proposed to create a substitute. He proposed to manufacture a being that would take up the tools the Igigi had thrown down, that would dig the canals and haul the baskets and bear the yoke of labor, so that the working gods could finally be relieved of it. And that substitute, that purpose-built laborer designed specifically to inherit the toil of the rebellious Igigi, was us. The human race was created, in the plainest reading of these tablets, as a replacement workforce. We were the answer to a strike. We exist because the beings who worked this earth before us refused to work it any longer, and their masters needed something new to carry the load, and so they built something, and the something was mankind. Every human being who has ever lived has lived in a world that was, according to the oldest writing on earth, established as a labor arrangement, and we were the labor. Now that alone would be reason enough to remember the Igigi, but it is not why they rank where they rank on this list. They rank here because of what they did after the human race was made, and this is where the tablets of Mesopotamia reach out and touch the pages of the book that half the world still reads in its houses of worship, and the two accounts, separated by centuries and by language and by faith, tell the same story with a consistency that ought to make the hair rise on your arms. Because the Igigi, having been relieved of their labor, having watched the new creature take up the tools they had thrown down, did not simply retire into the sky and forget about the earth. They looked at the beings that had been made to serve them. They looked at the human race. And in particular, the ancient traditions say, they looked at the human women, and they found them desirable, and they came down, and they took them. This is the point where two of the greatest streams of ancient tradition flow together into a single channel, and once you have seen the confluence, you cannot unsee it. On one side you have the Mesopotamian material, the Igigi, the working gods who came down from the sky and mingled with the human population they had helped to create. And on the other side you have a passage in the book of Genesis, brief and strange and long puzzled over, that describes exactly the same event in almost the same terms. It says that the sons of God, the beings of heaven, looked upon the daughters of men and saw that they were fair, and that they came down and took them as wives, and that the women bore them children. And the children of that union, Genesis says, were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the giants, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That single passage in the Hebrew Scriptures, tucked in just before the story of the Great Flood, is one of the most mysterious things in the entire book, and generations of readers have skated over it without stopping to ask what it means. But when you lay it beside the Mesopotamian account of the Igigi, it stops being mysterious and starts being corroboration. Two of the oldest written traditions on Earth, arising from the same part of the world, both preserve a memory of a specific event. Beings from the sky came down, took human mates, and produced offspring who were something more than human. Half of heaven and half of earth. A hybrid. And it goes deeper still, because the tradition that developed this idea most fully was not content to leave it at a brief and cryptic mention. In the older and larger body of writing that grew up around these same events, the book that tells the fuller story of the descent, the beings who came down are given a name that translates as the Watchers, the wakeful ones, the ones who do not sleep. And the account of what they did on the earth is detailed and specific and damning. They did not simply take human wives. They taught. By the same measure, they handed to the human race knowledge that the human race was not meant to have. They taught the working of metals, the making of weapons, and of ornaments. They taught the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, which is to say pharmacology and poison. Here too, they taught the reading of the stars and the signs of the sky. They taught the arts of cosmetics and of enchantment and of writing. And their offspring, the hybrids born of the union of the Watchers and the daughters of men, grew into a race of giants, of mighty ones, of beings who towered over ordinary humanity, and who consumed everything the earth could produce, and then turned upon humanity itself. The tradition presents this whole episode as a catastrophe, as the corruption of the human world by the descent of the sky beings and the mingling of their blood with ours, and it presents the great flood that follows as, in part, a response to it, an attempt to wash the corrupted bloodline off the face of the earth and start the human project again from the small remnant that remained pure. But here is the detail that matters most for this account, the detail that pulls the Igigi off the pages of ancient tablets and sets them down in the middle of your own city. The flood did not entirely work. The bloodline was not entirely erased. For that reason, the tradition itself admits this, because after the flood, the giants and the mighty ones reappear. The Nephilim are still spoken of. The mighty men of renown do not vanish from the record. And the ancient astronaut readers of this material draw the conclusion that the traditions themselves seem to invite. The blood of the sky beings, the mingled inheritance of the Igigi and the Watchers, was carried through the flood and preserved on the far side of it, and it entered the human line permanently, and it has been passed down, generation after generation, ever since. Which means that the descendants of that union are not a lost race of the deep past. They are here. They are among us. In the same way, they walk in ordinary human bodies, carrying in their veins a strain of something that came down from the sky before the flood, and there is no way to see it from the outside because a bloodline does not show on the surface. A person carrying the blood of the Igigi looks exactly like a person who is not, and that is the entire point. Consider the way the ancients themselves described their own greatest figures, because they were remarkably open about this. Their kings did not claim to be ordinary men. The oldest king list of Sumer, one of the strangest documents ever recovered, records a line of rulers before the flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years each, spans of life that no ordinary human could possibly attain, and it records this not as legend but as royal record, a straight administrative accounting of who ruled and for how long. And after the flood, the kings still claimed descent from the gods, still ruled as beings set apart from the common people, still carried, in their own official telling, the blood of the ones who came from the sky. The greatest hero of Mesopotamian literature, the king, whose epic is the oldest great story we possess, was described in his own tale as 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a precise fraction of divinity in a human frame, a hybrid measured out to the third. This was not a metaphor to the people who wrote it. It was a genealogy. The rulers of the ancient world claimed, matter-of-factly, to be part divine, to carry the blood of the beings from the sky in their own bodies, and to be therefore not the same as the human beings they ruled over. And if you take them at their word, then the hidden bloodline is not a secret at all. It was announced from the top of every ziggurat. The kings were the visible face of it, the part that admitted openly what it was, and beneath them, spreading out through the generations and the marriages and the centuries, ran the rest of it, unmarked, unannounced, folded into the ordinary population until it could not be told apart. The people who take the darkest view of this material follow the thread all the way to its unsettling end. They point out that the idea of a special bloodline, a line of descent set apart from ordinary humanity, carrying the inheritance of a higher and older source, entitled by that blood to rule, has never actually disappeared from human affairs. It runs through the divine kingship of the ancient world, the pharaohs who were gods on earth, the emperors who claimed descent from the heavens, the royal houses that guarded their bloodlines with an obsessive care, and married only among themselves, precisely to keep the blood from being diluted. Why, the readers ask, would a family guard a bloodline that fiercely, marry that narrowly, insist that generation after generation the blood be kept concentrated and unmixed, unless the blood itself was believed to carry something, unless there was thought to be a real and heritable difference between those who had it and those who did not? The ancient world believed, openly and without embarrassment, that some human beings carried the blood of the beings from the sky and that this made them a different kind of person, fit to rule the ordinary kind. And that belief did not die with Sumer. It went underground, the readers argue, exactly as everything on this list goes underground, and it has been running quietly beneath the surface of human history ever since. In the bloodlines that guard themselves so jealously, in the families that consider themselves set apart, in the ancient conviction that the right to rule is carried in the blood and inherited from above. Look more closely at the numbers the ancients themselves recorded, because they are stranger than any modern retelling admits. The oldest king list of Sumer does not merely say that the kings before the flood lived long. It gives figures, precise figures, reign lengths recorded in the same matter-of-fact administrative style as everything else on the list. And the figures are staggering. Reigns of 20,000 years. Reigns of 30,000 years. One early ruler credited with a reign of 36,000 years, another with even more. The whole antediluvian section of the list totaling spans of time that dwarf the entire recorded history of the human race that followed. And then the flood comes. And after the flood, the reign lengths drop. Still long by our standards, but no longer impossible. And they keep dropping as the list continues down toward historical times, until the kings are reigning for ordinary human lifetimes. The pattern is unmistakable. Before the flood, the rulers were something other than fully human, beings of enormous lifespan, closer to the gods than to us. After the flood, the divine longevity fades, generation by generation, as the blood of the sky beings is diluted by mixture with ordinary humanity, until at last the rulers become merely men. The king list is, read this way, a record of the fading of the divine bloodline, a chart of how the inheritance of the sky beings thinned out across the generations after the flood, and it was kept by the ancients not as legend, but as the official register of who had ruled and for how long. And the account of what the descended beings taught the human race deserves to be read in full, because it is not a vague gift of civilization but a specific and disturbing curriculum. They taught, the older tradition says, the making of swords and knives and shields and armor, the working of metals into weapons of war. They taught the making of bracelets and ornaments and the use of cosmetics, the beautifying of the body, and the arts of adornment and seduction. Even so, they taught the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, which is the knowledge of medicine and of poison, of what heals and what kills. They taught the reading of the stars and the signs of the sun and the moon, the knowledge of the heavens. They taught enchantments and the loosing of spells, the arts of magic. And they taught writing, the setting down of words. It is a curriculum of power, the whole toolkit by which a species masters its world and masters other members of its own kind, weapons and medicine and astronomy and magic and writing, and the tradition presents the teaching of it as a transgression, a handing over of knowledge that mankind was not meant to have, that corrupted the human world and provoked the catastrophe that followed. The descended beings did not merely mingle their blood with ours. They uploaded, into a species that had been designed for simple labor, the entire operating knowledge of civilization, and the tradition remembers this not as a blessing but as the beginning of the end of the innocent world. So the fifth of the nine is not a monster that slips into your house from outside. It is stranger and closer than that. It is a bloodline. What is more, it is the inheritance of the working gods who dug the rivers of the world before mankind existed, who rebelled and were replaced by us, and who then came down and mingled their blood with ours until the two could not be separated. They have been here longer than the human race, because they were here before the human race was made. And they are here now in the most intimate way any being on this list is here, not standing beside us but flowing within us, carried in the veins of the descendants of that ancient union, walking through the modern world in ordinary bodies with no mark upon them, indistinguishable from anyone. Because a person who carries the blood of heaven looks exactly like a person who does not. That is the disguise of the Igigi. It is not a face they put on. It is a face they were born with, the same as yours, wrapped around a lineage that came down out of the sky before the flood and never left. And yet even the Igigi, ancient as they are, present at the making of mankind, were not the first to walk among the human race, as teachers and as strangers. Before the blood ever mingled, before the sons of the sky ever took human wives, the first men had to be taught how to be men at all. Someone had to hand them the arts of civilization, the writing and the law, and the measuring of the stars and the building of the first cities, because a creature designed for labor does not invent astronomy on its own. And the beings who came to do that teaching, who rose up out of the water at the dawn of the human world wearing the skin of fish over the bodies of men, were older and stranger than the Igigi, and they are the fourth of the nine. The fourth being came out of the water. That is the first strange thing about it, and it is the thing that every later tradition remembered, because a being that comes out of the sea to teach the human race is such a specific and such an unnatural image that it does not arise on its own, and it does not fade once it has been planted. The Sumerians and the Babylonians called these beings the Apkallu, the sages, the seven wise ones, and they occupied a place in the ancient mind that no other beings on this list occupy. They were not feared. They were not enemies. On top of this, they were the teachers of mankind, the ones who came at the very dawn of the human world and handed to a newly made and utterly ignorant species everything it would need to become civilized, and they did it wearing a disguise so peculiar and so precise that when you finally understand what it was, you will understand why this tradition has haunted the human imagination for 4,000 years. The most complete account of them that survives does not come to us directly from a clay tablet, but through an unusual channel, and the channel itself is worth knowing about because it tells you how seriously this material was taken. Centuries after the height of Babylon, a Babylonian priest wrote down the traditions of his people in the Greek language so that the wider world could read them, and although his original work is lost, long passages of it were quoted by later writers and preserved, and among the things he recorded was the story of the first and greatest of the sages, a being he named Oannes. And the description he gives of Oannes is one of the most extraordinary passages to come down to us from the whole of the ancient world. In the very first year, he wrote, "There appeared out of the sea a creature endowed with reason. Its whole body was the body of a fish, but beneath the head of the fish there was another head, a human head, and beneath its tail there were human feet, and it had a human voice, and it could speak. This being came up out of the water in the daytime and moved among the people, and it ate no food, and it taught them. Sit with what it taught them, because the list is the reason the Apkallu matter, and it reads like an inventory of civilization itself. Oannes, the fish being from the sea, taught the human race letters and writing. He taught them the building of houses and the founding of temples and the making of cities. He taught them law and the drawing of boundaries. Above all, he taught them agriculture, the sowing of seed and the gathering of the harvest. He taught them the working of the land and the measuring of it. He taught them, in short, how to stop being animals and start being a civilization. And the account is explicit that after Oannes had given all of this to mankind, nothing further of any importance was invented because he had already handed over everything. And then, when the sun set, this being went back down into the sea and passed the night in the deep water because it was amphibious and could live in both worlds, and in the morning it came up again to continue the teaching. Day after day it rose from the water to instruct the human race, and night after night it returned to the deep until the whole foundation of human knowledge had been transferred from the being in the fish skin to the species it had come to uplift. Now the ancient astronaut readers of this material do something very simple with the description of Oannes, and the simplicity is what makes it so hard to dismiss. They read it literally, and they ask what it would actually describe. A being that comes out of the water. a being whose outer form is that of a fish, a covering, an outer skin, beneath which there is a human head and human feet and a human voice. For all that, a being that can move on the land and speak with people during the day, but must return to the water to spend the night, as though it cannot remain in the human environment indefinitely and must periodically return to a different one. A being that eats none of the food of the people it teaches. And a being whose entire purpose is to transfer an enormous body of advanced knowledge to a primitive species as quickly and as completely as possible. Strip away the assumption that this must be a myth, the readers say, and what you are left with is the description of something wearing a suit. The fish skin is not the being. The fish skin is what the being wears in order to function, an outer covering with a human form inside it, worn by something that comes from a medium the humans cannot enter, that cannot eat the local food, that must return each night to an environment suited to its own biology. In truth, the Apkallu, in this reading, were not fish and were not gods. They were visitors in protective coverings, sent to instruct a newly established population, appearing man-like within their apparatus and utterly alien outside of it. And the Assyrian kings, thousands of years after Oannes was first spoken of, still remembered exactly what the sages looked like, and they carved them into the walls of their palaces, and those carvings survive, and you can stand in front of them. Along the great stone slabs that lined the throne rooms and the temple walls of the Assyrian Empire, there march rows of figures that scholars call the fish-cloaked Apkallu, and they are unmistakable. They are shown as men, standing upright, performing rituals, but draped over their heads and down their backs is the skin of a great fish, the fish head sitting atop the human head like a hood, the fish body hanging down behind like a cloak. The image the Babylonian priest recorded in words is carved there in stone, the human form inside the fish covering, preserved by a people who considered these beings the source of all their wisdom and who wanted their protective image standing guard in the most important rooms of the kingdom. And there are other Apkallu figures too, carved with the heads of birds and great wings, holding a bucket and a cone, performing gestures whose meaning is lost, and these bird-formed sages stand in the same rooms, the same protective wise ones in a different aspect, guarding the king and the sacred spaces against the beings that pressed in from the dark. Whatever the Apkallu were, the ancient world did not forget their shape, and it did not stop carving them, because it believed they were the wisest and the most helpful of all the beings that had ever come to the human race. But the Apkallu do not belong on this list merely because they came from the water and wore a covering. They belong here because of what happened to them, and to their bloodline. And this is where they connect to everything we have already seen, and everything we are still climbing toward, because the sages did not remain purely outside the human race. The traditions of Mesopotamia are careful and specific on this point, and they distinguish between two things. There were the antediluvian sages, the 7 who came before the Great Flood, the fully alien instructors like Oannes who rose from the sea. And then there were the ones who came after, and the ones who came after were different. They were called the Umanu, the scholars, the learned men, and they were understood to be partly of human descent. The pure sages of the deep gave way, after the flood, to a line of half-human sages, wise men who carried the inheritance of the Apkallu in a human body, and these half-human sages became the advisors of kings. The tradition even preserves lists that pair each ancient king with the sage who counseled him, king and sage, all the way down the line, and as you move from the age before the flood to the age after it, the sages change from beings that came out of the sea into men who carried the blood and the knowledge of those beings inside an ordinary human frame. Do you see what that means, laid alongside the story of the Agigi we just left behind? It is the same pattern, arrived at from a different direction. The beings from beyond, whether the working gods or the teaching sages, came into contact with the human race, and their inheritance passed into the human line, and the result was a class of beings that were part human and part something else, walking among ordinary people, carrying knowledge and blood from a source that was not of this earth, and looking, from the outside, exactly like everyone else. The Agigi gave us the mighty men, the men of renown, the hybrid rulers. Time and again, the Apkallu gave us the Umanu, the half-divine scholars, the ones who stood at the right hand of every throne and held the deepest knowledge of the ancient world. And both of them, the warrior bloodline and the scholar bloodline, folded themselves into humanity so completely that after enough generations, there was no way to point to a person and say, that one carries it and that one does not. The disguise was total, because the disguise had become the body itself. There is a darker thread in the Apkallu tradition that most people never hear, and it deserves to be pulled into the light because it complicates the comfortable image of the sages as pure benefactors. Some of the ancient texts speak of apkallu, who transgressed, sages who did something they should not have done, who overstepped, who angered the gods, whose knowledge or whose actions crossed a line. The wise ones from the deep were not, in every telling, simply generous teachers. In some tellings they were dangerous, their wisdom, a double-edged gift, their descent into the human world, a thing that had consequences the gods themselves came to regret. And this fits uncomfortably well with the other great tradition of forbidden teaching that we have already touched. The tradition of the Watchers who taught humanity the things it was not meant to know, the metalworking and the sorcery and the cutting of roots. The line between the sage who uplifts and the Watcher who corrupts is thinner than the tidy versions of these stories admit. Both are beings from beyond who came down and handed advanced knowledge to a primitive species. Whether that handing over is remembered as salvation or as sin seems to depend mostly on who is telling the story and the same act. The transfer of forbidden knowledge from the higher beings to the lower ones sits at the root of both. The apkallu gave us civilization, and in giving it, they may also have given us something we were never designed to carry. And the ancient world seems to have understood, dimly and uneasily, that the gift and the curse were the same gift. And consider the single most consequential story attached to the sages, the story of the one who was offered immortality and lost it, because it reveals the true relationship between these beings and the ones who sent them, and it points directly at the higher levels of this list. The greatest of the human-aligned sages, in the oldest telling, was summoned up to the heavens, into the presence of the highest God. And there he was offered the bread of life and the water of life, the food and drink that would have made him, and through him, perhaps all of humanity, deathless. But he had been warned beforehand by his own patron, the God who had made him wise, that the food and drink offered to him in heaven would be the food and drink of death. And so, following that warning, he refused them. And in refusing them, he refused immortality, not only for himself, but, in the logic of the story, for the human race, which through him lost forever the chance at the deathless life it had been offered. It is a devastating story, and its meaning is bitterly clear. Mankind was, for one moment, standing at the threshold of becoming like the gods, of gaining the one thing that separated us from them, which was endless life. And that threshold was closed, and it was closed by a deception, a warning from a god that caused the sage to reject the very gift that would have lifted humanity up. Someone did not want the human race to have immortality. Someone made sure the door was shut, and that someone was operating at a level above the sages, giving them their warnings, sending them on their errands, deciding what knowledge the human race would be allowed to keep and what would be held forever out of reach. The ancients kept lists of these sages, and the lists themselves are among the most striking documents to survive, because they pair the sages with the kings they served, one by one, all the way down the line. Before the flood, the tradition held, there were 7 great sages, 7 apkallu, and each of them was the counselor of one of the antediluvian kings, king and sage, the ruler and the wise being from the deep, who stood at his right hand and held the knowledge that made his reign possible. The names of these 7 were remembered and recorded, strange names that the scribes preserved with care. And the first and greatest of them was the one the later Babylonian priest called Oannes, the fish being who rose from the sea to teach mankind everything. And after the flood, the lists continue. But now they record the sages of human descent, the Umanu, the scholars who carried the inheritance of the apkallu in mortal bodies. And these too are paired with the kings they served, the wise man at the side of the ruler, generation after generation, the knowledge of the deep passed down through a line of half-divine counselors who stood always just behind the throne. The structure is the same one we keep finding at every level of this account, the visible ruler and the hidden knowledge behind him, the king who reigns and the being of the deep who whispers the wisdom that makes the reign possible, and the ancients recorded it openly, in list after list, king and sage, down through all the ages of the world. And the apkallu appeared in more than one form, which is itself a clue to their nature. Alongside the fish-cloaked sages, the palace walls of the later empires show other wise ones, figures with the heads of birds and great feathered wings, standing upright in human bodies, performing the same protective rituals, guarding the same sacred spaces. These bird-formed apkallu carry a small bucket in one hand and raise a cone in the other, making a gesture toward the king or the sacred tree whose meaning has been lost, and they stand in the throne rooms and the temple chambers in their rows, watching, warding, the same wise protectors in a different aspect. Fish and bird, the creatures of the sea and the creatures of the air. The sages took the forms of the 2 realms that mankind could not enter, the deep water and the high sky, as though to mark that they came from somewhere other than the solid ground of the human world, from the media we cannot live in, appearing among us in coverings shaped like the creatures of those other realms? The ancient astronaut readers make much of this. The sages who wear the forms of the sea and the sky, the beings from the elements humanity cannot survive in, coming to the land to teach and returning, each night, or each age, to the deep or the heights from which they came. Which brings us, at last, to the question that has been building beneath every one of these beings, growing larger with each level we climb. The Apkallu were sent. The sages did not decide on their own to rise from the sea and teach mankind. They were emissaries. They came from the deep water, and the deep water, in the Sumerian cosmos, was the domain of one particular god, the master of the abyss, and of wisdom, and of the making of mankind. And the sages were his agents, dispatched by him into the human world to carry out his purposes. And that god, in turn, was one of a council, one of a family, one of a ruling order of beings who had divided this world among themselves and who governed it from behind the scenes, and whose collective name is the name we began with, the name that is the key to the entire mystery, the name that means those who came down from the sky. The sages were the hand, the bloodlines were the reach. But the ones who sent the sages and shaped the bloodlines, the ones who sat at the top of the whole structure and decided what mankind would be permitted to become, were the great ruling beings themselves, and they are the third of the 9, and they have been here from the beginning, hiding not in the birthing room or the bedroom or the crowd, but in the one place no one ever thinks to look for a monster, which is the seat of power itself. The third being is the one this whole account has been circling from the very first words, and now we arrive at it directly. It is the ruling order itself. It is the council of the great beings who came down from the sky, who divided this world among themselves, who established kingship and law and the temple, who made mankind to serve them, and then arranged the entire structure of human society around that service. By the same token, it is the Anunnaki, and where the beings below them slip into the human world through a birthing room or a bedroom or a crowd, the Anunnaki entered it through the throne, and they have never entirely left it, because the throne is a thing that outlives every particular person who ever sat upon it, and a being that hides inside an institution can hide there for as long as the institution endures. Begin with the name, because everything is in the name, and the ancient astronaut reading and the cautious scholarly reading both start from the same syllables and only afterward walk in different directions. The name is built from pieces that the scribes themselves recognized. There is the element that refers to the Sky Father, Anu, whose name simply means heaven, the highest of the high, the source of the ruling line. There is the element that speaks of princely seed, of royal offspring, of a lineage set apart and above. And there is, in the fullest form of the name, the element that means earth, the ground, this world. The most careful scholars read the whole as something like the princely offspring, the seed of the High One, the royal line descended from heaven. And the ancient astronaut readers take those very same pieces, the heaven, the royal seed, the earth, and read them as a sentence that describes an action rather than merely a status. Those of the royal seed of heaven who came down to the earth, the ones who descended from the sky to this world. And whichever reading you prefer, notice that they agree on the substance. This is a ruling lineage. This is a line of beings who are of heaven and who are associated with the earth, a royal seed from above set down upon the ground below, and they are the great ones, the deciders, the top of the entire order of being. Even the cautious reading gives you a race of celestial royalty ruling over the human world. The bold reading simply adds the one word that the whole rest of the tradition is screaming anyway, which is that they came down. And what did they do when they came down? The tablets are explicit, and the first thing they did was divide the world. In the great account of the beginning, the ruling beings cast lots. They drew for their portions, and they parceled out the domains of the cosmos among themselves, like heirs dividing an estate. To the Sky Father went the heavens. To the great Lord of the command went the earth and the air and the surface of the world where mankind would live and labor. Past that point, to the Master of wisdom, and the deep went the waters, the underground sweet waters, the abyss, the domain of secret knowledge. The world was divided by lot among the ruling beings, each taking his sphere, each becoming the lord of his allotted portion. And mankind, when mankind was made to serve within this divided estate, to work the ground that belonged to the lords of the ground, and to fill the granaries and the temples that were the houses of the gods. This is not the picture of a single loving creator presiding over a garden. It is the picture of a board of directors dividing up territory, a ruling council allotting spheres of authority, and then installing a workforce to generate the wealth and do the labor within the domains they had claimed. The human race, from its first day, lived inside a management structure, and the Anunnaki were the management. Look at how they ruled. because the mechanism of their rule is the thing that lets them hide to this day. They did not, for the most part, rule the human race directly, hand to hand, God standing over worker. They ruled through an institution, and the institution was kingship. The oldest document of Sumerian history, the King List, opens with a line that ought to be far more famous than it is. A line that states the entire theory of ancient government in a handful of words. When kingship was lowered from heaven, it says, kingship was in a certain city, and it names the city, and then it begins its long roll of the kings who reigned. Kingship was lowered from heaven. It was not invented by men. It was not something the human race worked out for itself as its societies grew. Just as clearly, it was handed down, installed from above, a divine institution lowered into the human world by the ruling beings so that the human world could be governed on their behalf. The king was not simply a powerful man. The king was the point of contact, the appointed steward, the one through whom the ruling beings exercised their authority over the workforce without having to appear in person. He held the kingship that had been lowered from heaven, and he held it as a trust, ruling in the name of and on behalf of the gods, whose house was the great temple at the center of his city. And the temple itself, the ziggurat, that vast stepped mountain of brick that dominated every Sumerian city, was not a place of public worship in the way we might imagine. It was a house. That is what the word for it meant. It was the house of the god, the residence of the ruling being who owned that city, and it was built and maintained and provisioned exactly as you would build and maintain and provision the residence of a lord who was expected to be present. The god was fed. Meals were prepared and brought to the god in the temple. Real food, laid out for the god to consume. The god was clothed, washed, attended, entertained. An entire economy revolved around the physical upkeep of a being who lived at the top of the artificial mountain, at the center of the city, and the human population labored to keep that being housed and fed and served. This is a very strange thing to do for a god who is a pure spirit, an abstraction, a symbol. It is a perfectly ordinary thing to do for a lord who is actually there, actually resident in the great house, actually consuming the offerings brought up to him. The ancient astronaut readers point at the whole apparatus of the temple economy, the feeding and clothing and housing of the god, and they ask the obvious question. Why would people build a residence and staff it, and cook daily meals for it, and treat the whole thing with the deadly seriousness of a real household, unless someone was living there? The temple was a house because it housed someone. The city labored to provision its god because the god was present and had to be provisioned. That is how the ruling beings lived among the human race, in the age of open rule. At the top of the mountain, in the great house, fed and served by the workforce they had made, governing through the king who held the kingship that had been lowered to him from the sky. But the age of open rule ended, and this is the hinge of the entire mystery, and it is where the Anunnaki step out of the visible world and into the hidden one where the rest of this list lives. At some point, the gods stopped being present in the way they had been. The great houses were still maintained, the rituals still performed, but the beings themselves withdrew from the direct, physical, daily governance of the human world. The kings continued to rule, but now they ruled in the name of gods who no longer appeared, gods who had become invisible, gods who spoke, if they spoke at all, through omens and signs and the interpretations of priests, rather than through direct command from the top of the mountain. Once again, the tradition remembers this as a withdrawal, a stepping back, an ending of the age when everyone knew the ruling beings were there because you could carry their dinner up to them. And the question that hangs over that withdrawal is the question that hangs over this entire account. Did they leave, or did they merely stop being visible? The ancient astronaut readers give the answer that the structure of history itself seems to suggest, and it is an answer that should make you look very differently at the world you live in. They did not leave, the readers say. They changed their method. In the age of open rule, they governed from the top of the visible mountain, and everyone knew who ruled. In the age that followed, they governed from behind the institution they had installed, and no one knew who ruled, because the point of contact was now a man, a king, a priesthood, a structure of human authority that carried out the will of the hidden ones without the hidden ones ever having to show their faces. The kingship that had been lowered from heaven did not stop being lowered from heaven just because the heaven it came from had become invisible. The structure remained. In turn, the institution remained. The concentration of authority at the top, the treatment of the ruler as a being set apart, the belief that the right to command came from above and was held in trust, all of it remained, and it remained. The readers argue because the ones who had built it were still there, still at the top of it, still exercising their rule through it, only now from behind a curtain instead of from the top of a tower. The Anunnaki did not abdicate. They went into hiding, and the thing they hid inside was the institution of power itself. Think about what a perfect hiding place that is, because it is the most perfect on this entire list. Every other being we have met must wear a body. The collector must take the shape of a man in the crowd. The night visitor must become the phantom lover. Beyond that, the sages had to climb into their fish skins. Even the bloodlines of the Igigi and the Apakalu, hidden as they are still tied to particular bodies born and dying in the ordinary course of things. But an institution has no body, and therefore it never dies. A throne outlives the king who sits on it. A structure of authority outlives every particular person who holds a place in it. And a being that hides not inside a body but inside an institution has found a way to persist through the centuries without ever having to be born or to die or to be pointed at, because the thing it inhabits is not a person but a pattern. And a pattern can run through 1,000 generations of human beings, each of them merely a temporary occupant of a role that was designed and installed and is still owned by something older than all of them. The ancient astronaut readers say that this is exactly what the Anunnaki did. They did not hide in a man. They hid in the shape of power, in the throne and the crown and the priesthood and the temple treasury and the whole vast machinery of rule that they had lowered into the human world, and they have been running it from the inside ever since, through occupant after occupant, none of whom ever needed to know whose structure they were truly maintaining. There is a detail in the tablets that sharpens all of this into something genuinely unsettling, and it is the way the Anunnaki are described in their second great function, because they had two faces, and the second face is the one that connects the ruling council to the collectors we met at the very bottom of this list. The same name, the Anunnaki, is used in the oldest texts not only for the great ruling gods of heaven but also for the judges of the underworld, the tribunal of the dead, the ones who sit in the world below and render the verdicts that decide the fate of every soul that comes before them. The ruling council above and the tribunal below bear the same name, because they are, in the logic of the tablets, the same order of being, exercising the same authority in both worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. And that means the reach of the Anunnaki is total. They govern the human being in life through the institution of kingship and the whole structure of earthly power, and they judge the human being in death through the tribunal of the underworld, and the collectors, the Galyu, are the officers who carry out the sentences of that tribunal, dragging the marked soul down to stand before the judges. Trace the arm all the way back, as we said we would at the very beginning, and this is where it leads. The collector at the bottom of the list is the hand. The tribunal of the underworld is the will that moves the hand. And the tribunal of the underworld and the ruling council of heaven are the same beings, the Anunnaki, the royal seed from the sky, governing the human race, from the throne in life and from the seat of judgment in death, above and below, the whole of a human existence held between the two jaws of a single ruling order that made us to serve it, and has never, in life or in death, let us out of its authority. The people who take the very darkest view of this material follow the pattern into the present, and here we must be careful, because this is the point where the genre often loses its footing and starts pointing fingers at particular living people, and that is a mistake and a slander, and it is not what the tablets support. What the tablets support is something more abstract and, in its way, more disturbing than any list of names. It is the observation that the structure of concentrated power, the pattern of the few ruling the many from behind a veil of legitimacy that claims to descend from something higher, the treatment of authority as a trust handed down, rather than a thing that rises up from the governed, has proven to be the single most durable feature of human civilization. It was there at the beginning, in Sumer, lowered from heaven, and it has never gone away. Every age has its version of the throne, its version of the priesthood that interprets the will of the unseen, its version of the small circle at the top that governs the vast workforce below, and insists that its right to do so comes from a source the workforce cannot see or question. The ancient astronaut readers do not say that any particular modern institution is run by beings from the sky. What they say is subtler and harder to shake. They say that the pattern itself, the deep template of rule that keeps reasserting itself in every civilization no matter how many times it is overthrown, was not invented by human beings. They say it was installed. More than that, they say it was lowered into the human world at the beginning by beings who designed it to keep a workforce governed, and that the reason it will not die, the reason it comes back in a new costume every time it is torn down, is that it was never really ours to tear down, because it was never really ours to begin with. It belongs to the ones who lowered it from heaven, and they are still, in the only sense that matters, at the top of it. There is a concept in the Sumerian material that makes the machinery of this control explicit, and it deserves to be named because it is the clearest statement the ancients ever gave of how completely the ruling beings owned the operating system of human civilization. The Sumerians spoke of the me, a word that has no exact translation, but that meant something like the divine decrees, the fundamental powers and offices and institutions that make ordered life possible. The me were the underlying programs of civilization, and the texts list them in long inventories, and the list is astonishing in its scope. Kingship was a me, priesthood was a me, truth and falsehood were me. The arts of the scribe and the smith and the builder were me. Music was a me. War was a me. The very rites of the temple and the customs of the household and the structures of law were me, each one a discrete power or institution, and the crucial point is that the me belonged to the gods. They were divine property. The institutions of civilization were not things the human race had developed for itself. They were possessions of the ruling beings, held by them, controlled by them, granted to the human world on the terms the gods set. Human civilization ran on the me, and the me belonged to the Anunnaki, and that means the entire structure of ordered human life was, in the Sumerian understanding, a set of divine programs installed and owned and controlled by the beings who came from the sky. We did not build our civilization. It was issued to us, decree by decree, and the ones who held the decrees held us. And the daily life of the temple makes the physical reality of the arrangement impossible to wave away as mere symbol. The great houses at the center of every city were staffed and provisioned exactly as the residence of a present lord would be. There were fixed meals, brought to the god at set hours, real food laid out on the god's table, bread and meat and beer and the produce of the fields, prepared by temple cooks and carried in by temple servants, and set before the divine presence to be consumed. There were the god's garments, changed and cleaned and stored. By the same measure, there was the god's bed, the god's bath, the god's throne, the god's entertainment. Entire estates, vast holdings of farmland and herds and workshops, existed for the single purpose of generating the wealth to maintain the god in the manner of a great lord, and thousands of human beings labored their whole lives inside this economy, growing the grain and brewing the beer and weaving the cloth and cooking the meals that kept the god of the city housed and fed and served. This is not how a people treats an abstraction. It is how a people provisions a resident ruler, and the ancient astronaut readers ask the question that the sheer physicality of it forces, which is why an entire civilization would organize its economy around the daily feeding of a being unless that being was present to be fed. So the third of the nine is not a creature you will ever meet in the shape of a person, and that is precisely what makes it the most deeply hidden of them all. It is the ruling order itself, the council of the royal seed from the sky, hiding not in a body but in the throne, not in a face but in the pattern of power, governing the human race from behind the institution it installed at the dawn of civilization, and has maintained through every age since. It made us to serve it. Here, too, it divided the world and set us to labor within the division. It rules us in life through the structure of authority and judges us in death through the tribunal of the underworld, and its officers walk up out of the dark to collect the marked when the sentence is passed. It is the whole machine, and we are inside it. And we have been inside it for so long that we mistake the walls of it for the natural shape of the world. But a council is still an abstraction, and an abstraction does not knock on a single door or shape a single life or come, personally, to the making of a single man. And among the ruling beings, there was one in particular who did all of those things, one who was closer to the human race than any of the others, one who made us with his own hands and saved us against the wishes of his own kind, and has, if the tablets are to be believed, tended and manipulated and moved among his creation more intimately and more continuously than any other being that has ever worn our shape. He is the second of the nine, and to the human race, he was the nearest thing we ever had to a maker, and also, perhaps, the nearest thing we ever had to a master pulling the strings from just behind the veil. The second being has a name, and unlike the ruling council, he is not an abstraction, not a pattern, not an institution. He is a person, or he was described as one, the most vividly drawn and the most active of all the beings that ever ruled this world, and he was closer to the human race than any of the others because he was the one who made us. His name was Enki in the older tongue and Ea in the tongue that came after. And to understand why he stands second on this list, second only to the oldest disguise of all, you have to understand that he was, in the most literal sense, the tablets allow our maker, our benefactor, our secret protector, and quite possibly our most patient and most invisible manipulator, all at once, all in the same being, and that these things were never in contradiction, because a being can love the thing it made and use it at the same time, exactly as a farmer loves the field he also lives off of. Enki was the lord of the deep, the master of the sweet waters that lie beneath the earth. The abyss the Sumerians called the Abzu, and his city was Eridu, which the oldest traditions name as the very first city, the place where kingship first descended, the beginning of everything. He was the god of wisdom, of craft, of magic, of incantation, of cleverness and cunning, and the finding of solutions to problems that seemed to have none. Among the ruling beings, who tended toward the blunt exercise of power, Enki was the mind, the schemer, the one who thought his way around obstacles that the others would have simply smashed. And it was this quality, this cleverness, this willingness to find the third path where the others saw only the two obvious ones, that shaped the entire history of the human race. Because at every point where the fate of mankind hung in the balance, it was Enki who tilted it toward survival. And he did it not by force but by a trick, a workaround, a clever bending of a rule that his fellow gods had thought was unbendable. Return to the moment of our making, because it was his idea, and the way it was his idea tells you everything about his relationship to us. When the working gods rebelled, when the labor of the world became intolerable, and the Agigi threw down their tools, it was Enki who rose in the assembly of the gods and proposed the solution. He did not propose to crush the strikers. He proposed to create. For that reason, he proposed to make a new being that could carry the burden, and he knew exactly how to do it, because he was the master of the deep and of the secret knowledge of how living things are formed. He called upon the mother goddess, the great womb of the gods, and together they took clay, the raw material of the earth, and they mixed into it the flesh and the blood of a god, one of the divine beings slain for exactly this purpose, so that the new creature would carry within it something of the divine, a spark of the intelligence and the will of the gods, enough to understand orders and to do skilled work. And from that mixture of earthly clay and divine blood, shaped by the hands of the mother goddess and quickened by the wisdom of Enki, the first human beings were formed. He designed us. He specified the mixture. In the same way, he was the engineer of our creation, and we were his solution to a labor problem. And every human being alive carries, according to the oldest account of our origin, a measure of divine blood in the clay of the body, precisely because Enki put it there on purpose to make us fit for the work. But here is the thing that lifts Enki out of the ranks of the cold designers and makes him the most sympathetic and the most dangerous of all the ruling beings at once. Having made us, he did not treat us as a disposable tool. He took an interest. He became, again and again, the protector of the thing he had built, and he did so in direct defiance of the chief of the gods, the lord of the earth and the air, Enlil, who comes across in tablet after tablet as the great antagonist of the human race, the one who found us noisy and troublesome, and who repeatedly resolved to wipe us out. And every time Enlil moved to destroy mankind, Enki moved to save it, quietly, cleverly, from behind the scenes, using his wits to undo the decrees of a being more powerful than himself. The pattern is laid out most fully in the great account of the early world, and it reads like a slow escalation, a series of attempts by the chief god to reduce or eliminate the human population, each one thwarted by the cleverness of the god who had made them. First, the tablets say, mankind multiplied and grew loud, and the noise of the human world rose up and disturbed the chief god, and he could not sleep for the clamor of the beings on the earth, and so he sent a plague, a sickness to thin the human numbers and quiet the world. And Enki, seeing this, went secretly to the wisest of men, to the human who was his special favorite, and he told him how to turn the plague aside, which offerings to make, and which god to appeal to, and the plague was lifted, and mankind survived and multiplied again. Even so, and again the noise rose, and again the chief god was disturbed, and this time he sent a drought, and held back the rains, and the fields withered and the people began to starve. And again Enki went secretly to his favorite and told him how to survive it, and again mankind endured. The chief god sent famine, he sent salt to poison the ground. He sent one calamity after another, each meant to break the human race, and behind each one stood Enki, whispering to his chosen man the way through it, keeping his creation alive against the express will of the highest god, because he would not let the thing he had made be destroyed. And then came the flood, and the flood is the greatest of these stories, and it is the one that the whole world remembers under other names, and it is the purest example of Enki, as the being who saves the human race by outwitting his own kind. Because the chief god, having failed to reduce mankind by plague and drought and famine, finally resolved on total annihilation. He would send a flood, a deluge that would cover the whole earth and drown every living human being, and wipe the human experiment off the face of the world once and for all. And this time he was determined that there would be no clever rescue, no whispered workaround, and so he bound all the gods, Enki among them, by a solemn oath, an oath that none of them would warn mankind of what was coming. The human race was to be destroyed, and no god was to reveal the secret. And Enki, bound by his oath, unable to speak to any human being directly and tell them to flee, found the loophole. And the loophole is one of the cleverest and most famous tricks in all of ancient literature. He did not speak to the man, he spoke to the wall. What is more, he went to the reed hut of his chosen human, the one the tablets call by various names in various versions, the man who would become the Mesopotamian original of every flood survivor and every later tradition. And Enki addressed his words not to the man, but to the reed wall of the man's dwelling, speaking as though to the wall itself, warning the wall of the coming flood, instructing the wall to tear down the house and build a boat, to abandon possessions and save life, to take aboard the seed of every living thing. He spoke to the wall, and the man sitting on the other side of that wall overheard every word. Enki had kept his oath to the letter. He had warned no human being. He had merely spoken to a wall, and it was not his fault if a man happened to be listening. And by that trick, that clever and deliberate evasion of an oath sworn before all the gods, the human race was saved from total extinction, because the man built the boat and rode out the flood that drowned the rest of the world, and came to rest at last on a mountain as the waters fell, and from him and his the human race began again. Every version of the flood survivor that came after, in every scripture and every legend of every people, descends from this Mesopotamian original, and in the Mesopotamian original, the survivor lives because one god loved the human race enough to cheat his own oath and warn a wall. Now hold the whole shape of Enki in your mind, because the shape is the reason he ranks where he ranks, and the reason he is so much more unsettling than a simple benevolent creator would be. He made us as a workforce. That was the origin, the labor solution, the clay and the divine blood mixed to produce a being fit for toil. And then he protected that workforce, again and again, against a chief god who wanted it destroyed. And the question that hangs over all of it, the question the tablets never quite answer and the ancient astronaut readers never stop asking, is why? Why did Enki save us, over and over, at such cost, in defiance of the highest god, through plague and drought and famine and flood? Was it love? A genuine attachment of the maker to the made? The affection of a creator for his creation? Or was it something colder and more practical? The reluctance of an owner to see a valuable asset destroyed, the calculation of a being who had built a workforce and did not want to lose it, who protected mankind for the same reason a man protects his herd, not out of sentiment but out of interest? The tablets hold both readings at once and refuse to choose between them. And that refusal is the exact center of what makes Enki the second of the nine. He is the maker who loves us and the master who uses us, and there is no line in any tablet that tells you which one he truly was, because in the mind of the ancient world there may have been no difference. The being who made you to serve him, and who keeps you alive so that you can go on serving him, and who is fond of you in the way one is fond of a thing that is useful and clever in one's own, is not your enemy, but he is not your friend in the way you would want a friend to be either. He is your owner, and the most dangerous kind of owner, because he is the kind you love back. Consider the other face of Enki, the trickster, the one who bends every rule, because it deepens the unease rather than relieving it. This was the god who, in one famous tale, was made drunk by the goddess Inanna, and in his drunkenness handed over to her, the me, the divine decrees, the fundamental powers and institutions of civilization itself, the arts and the crafts, and the offices, and the very foundations of ordered human life, which he had been keeping under his control. He gave them away while intoxicated, and then, sober and horrified, he sent his servants again and again to chase down the goddess and take them back, and he failed, and the powers of civilization passed out of his keeping and into the human world. It is a comic story on its surface, a tale of a god who drank too much and gave away the store, but underneath it is a serious claim about the nature of Enki, which is that he was the keeper of the me, the holder of the operating instructions of civilization, the god who controlled the release of the very things that made human society possible. The knowledge of how to be civilized was his to give or to withhold, and the tablets show him doing both, guarding it jealously, and then, whether by drunken accident or by some deeper design, letting it flow out into the human world. Everything the human race knows how to do, the tablets suggest, it knows because Enki, at some point, in some mood, allowed it to have the knowledge. He was the gatekeeper of civilization, and we pass through the gate on the terms he set or the terms he let slip. And remember the bitterest story of all, the one we touched when we spoke of the sages, the story of the man who was offered immortality in heaven and refused it, because the god who arranged that refusal was Enki. and his role in it is the single most troubling thing attached to his name. The wisest of men, Enki's own favorite, the one he had made brilliant above all other humans, was summoned up to the presence of the highest god, and there he would be offered the bread and the water of eternal life. And Enki, who had made this man wise, gave him a warning before he went. He told him that the food and drink offered to him in heaven would be the food and drink of death, and that he must refuse them. And the man, trusting the God who had made him, obeyed, and refused the bread and the water, and only afterward learned that they had been the bread and the water of life, and that by refusing them he had refused immortality, not only for himself but for the human race that he represented. Mankind stood at the threshold of becoming deathless, of gaining the one thing that separated us from the gods, and Enki, our maker, our protector, the being who had saved us from flood and famine, made sure we did not cross it. He kept us mortal. He shut the door on eternal life with a warning that was, at best, a terrible misunderstanding, and at worst, a deliberate deception designed to keep the human race in its place, alive but mortal, clever but finite, useful but never equal. Why would the God who loved us enough to save us from the flood also make sure we never became immortal? The ancient astronaut readers give the answer that follows from everything else about him. Because an immortal workforce is not a workforce anymore. Because a being that lives forever cannot be ruled the way a being that fears death can be ruled. On top of this, because the whole arrangement, the whole management structure, the whole relationship between the ruling beings and the human race they had made to serve them depended on the human race remaining what it had been designed to be, which was mortal, limited, dependent, always dying and always being replaced, never accumulating enough time or enough knowledge to challenge the ones above. Enki saved us from destruction because he did not want to lose his creation. And Enki denied us immortality because he did not want his creation to stop being his creation. Both acts served the same purpose. Both kept the human race alive and in its place. The being who protected us and the being who limited us were the same being, doing the same thing, which was preserving the arrangement, and the arrangement required us to live, and it required us to die, and Enki made sure of both. There is one more thing about Enki that we have been circling for this entire account, and it is the thing that carries us across the threshold into the last and oldest of the nine. Enki's symbol, the sign by which he was known, the emblem that appeared beside him and represented his nature, was the serpent. The god of wisdom and of the deep and of secret knowledge was associated again and again, in image after image, with the snake, with the entwined serpents, with the creature that sheds its skin and renews itself and moves between the world above and the world below. The serpent was the sign of the wisdom god, the mark of the one who gave knowledge to mankind. And this is not a small or an accidental detail, because when you carry it forward into the traditions that inherited the Mesopotamian world, it becomes the key that unlocks the final door. Because there is another story, told by a people who lived not far from Sumer and who inherited a great deal from it, a story about a garden, and a first man and a first woman, and a tree of knowledge that they were forbidden to eat from, and a serpent that came to them and told them that if they ate the forbidden fruit they would not die, but would instead become like gods, knowing good and evil. And the god of that garden, the one who had forbidden the fruit, was furious when they ate it. And his fury was not that they had disobeyed for its own sake, but that, as he himself said, the human beings had now become like one of the gods, knowing good and evil, and that the only thing left to prevent was that they should also eat from the tree of life and live forever. And so he drove them out of the garden, specifically and explicitly to keep them from the tree of life, to keep them from becoming immortal. Do you hear it? Do you hear the same story, told twice in two traditions from the same corner of the world? A being associated with the serpent, a bringer of forbidden knowledge, offers the human race the chance to become like the gods. A chief god, threatened by this, intervenes to keep mankind mortal, to shut the door on eternal life, to preserve the gap between the human and the divine. In the Mesopotamian telling, the wisdom god Enki, whose symbol is the serpent, gives mankind knowledge and craft and civilization, and a warning about immortality keeps us mortal. In the telling of the garden, a serpent gives the first humans the knowledge of good and evil, offers them the chance to be like gods, and a chief god drives them from the garden to keep them from the tree of life. The ancient astronaut readers, and they are not alone in this, look at these two stories side by side and they say the obvious and shattering thing. They are the same event. They are the same being. The serpent of the garden and the serpent god of wisdom are one. The giver of knowledge who set the human race on the path toward becoming like its makers, and who was opposed at every turn by a higher power determined to keep mankind in its designed place, mortal and dependent and serving. Enki is the serpent. The serpent is Enki. And the being who gave us the knowledge that made us dangerous to our own masters is the same being who has been tending and shaping and guiding the human race from the very beginning. The maker who never stopped meddling, the protector who never stopped watching, the owner who never stopped tending the herd. Consider how the ancients pictured him, because even his imagery carries the double nature that defines him. He was shown with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, the sweet waters of the deep pouring out of his very body, and in those streams swam fish, the abundance of life issuing from the god of the abyss, the giver of the waters that made the flat land fertile and fed the human race he had built. He was the friend of mankind, the one who gave us water and life and knowledge, and his imagery is full of generosity, of overflowing abundance, of life pouring out. And yet the same God was the master of the underground deep, the abyss beneath the world, the dark waters below, the domain of secrets and of the dead who dwelt in the earth. He was the light giver and the Lord of the dark places at once, the God of the fresh water that brings life, and the God of the deep abyss that lies beneath everything. And the ancients held both of these together in the single figure without any sense of contradiction, because they understood, as we have had to learn across this whole account, that the being who gives you life and the being who owns you are not necessarily two different beings. They can be one. They can pour out water with one hand and hold the keys of the abyss with the other. That was Enki, the most generous and the most cunning of the gods, the maker who loved his creation and the master who would never let it go free. And that is why Enki stands only at the second place, and not the first, though he is the maker of mankind and the most active of all the gods in human affairs. Because the serpent, the giver of forbidden knowledge, the shape that Enki wore, and the emblem that marked him, is older than Enki the person, older than the name Enki, older than any name at all. The serpent is the oldest thing on this list. It is the shape that was there before the first man, coiled at the root of the tree of knowledge in the garden at the beginning of the world. And it is the shape that has appeared in every tradition of every people since. The serpent of wisdom, the serpent of the underworld, the serpent that sheds its skin and never dies, the feathered serpent and the world serpent, and the serpent coiled around the tree. It is the single most persistent image in the entire religious memory of the human race, and it always means the same thing, and it always appears at the same moment, at the threshold between ignorance and knowledge, between the human and the divine, offering the fruit, whispering that you will not die, that you will become like gods. Enki wore it. But the serpent was not Enki's alone. It was there before him. And it is the first of the nine, the oldest disguise, the being that has been here the longest, and it has been here the longest for the simplest and most terrible of reasons, which is that it was here before there was anyone at all for it to hide among. The first being is a shape, and it is the oldest shape in the world. Every being we have climbed past to reach it, all 8 of them, from the collectors of the dead at the bottom to Enki the maker just below, is in some sense a variation on this one, a later and more specialized form of the thing that came first. And the thing that came first was the serpent. Not a serpent, not any particular snake in any particular story, but the serpent, the archetype, the primordial coiled shape that appears at the beginning of every tradition the human race has ever produced, always at the same moment, always doing the same thing, always meaning the same thing, and it stands at the top of this list, first of the 9, the one that has been here the longest, for a reason that goes deeper than any of the others. It has been here the longest because it was here before us. It was here before the human race was made, before the first man opened his eyes, and it was there, according to the oldest accounts, at the very making of the world itself, coiled at the root of creation, and it has never, in all the ages since, gone away. Begin with the universality of it, because the universality is the first and greatest mystery, and no one has ever fully explained it. The serpent is a symbol of hidden wisdom, of the boundary between the human and the divine, of forbidden knowledge and immortality and the threshold that must not be crossed, appears in essentially every civilization on Earth, in cultures that had no contact with one another, separated by oceans and continents and thousands of years, and it appears in all of them with the same cluster of meanings attached. In Mesopotamia, the serpent was the symbol of the god of wisdom and the sign of healing and renewal, and it coiled around the staff of the deities of medicine, a form we still carry today in the emblems of our own physicians without most of us knowing where it came from. In the land of the great river to the south, the serpent reared upon the brow of the ruler, the guardian, and the mark of divine kingship, rising from the forehead of the god-king as a sign of the power that came from above. Far across the world, in lands the old world did not even know existed, a feathered serpent descended from the sky to teach mankind civilization, and the calendar and the arts, the very same role the fish sages played in Sumer, a serpent from above bringing knowledge to men. In the traditions of the great subcontinent to the east, serpent beings of surpassing wisdom guarded the deepest secrets and moved between the human world and the hidden ones. And everywhere, in nearly every mythology that has ever been recorded, there is a great serpent at the beginning of things, or coiled around the world, or lurking at the root of the tree that joins the earth to the heavens. The serpent is the one symbol that the entire human race seems to share, and it always sits at the same place: the threshold of knowledge, the boundary of the divine, the point where a human being might become something more than human, and the serpent is always the one standing at that boundary, offering to help you cross it. Now, the ordinary explanation for this universality is that snakes are frightening and mysterious animals, that they shed their skin and appear to renew themselves, that they move without limbs and strike without warning and carry venom that kills, and that human beings everywhere independently developed a fascination and a dread of them and wove that dread into their myths. And there is truth in that explanation, and it accounts for some of it, but it does not account for the specificity. It does not account for why the serpent is not merely feared, but is, again and again, the bringer of wisdom, the giver of forbidden knowledge, the being that offers to make the human race like the gods. A simple fear of a dangerous animal would produce myths of monsters to be slain, and there are those too, but it would not produce, over and over, in culture after culture, the very particular figure of the wise serpent, the knowing serpent, the serpent that comes to the threshold of the divine and beckons humanity across it, and is opposed by a higher god who wants humanity to stay where it is. That figure is too specific, too consistent, too tied to the exact same cluster of ideas about knowledge and immortality and the boundary between man and God to be explained by a general dislike of snakes. Something more than fear planted the wise serpent at the root of every human tradition, and the ancient astronaut readers say that the something was a memory, a real encounter with a real presence, preserved in the deepest layer of the human mind and expressed, in every land, through the same ancient image. And that memory, if it is a memory, goes back further than the making of mankind, because in the oldest Mesopotamian account of the origin of everything, the serpent is there before the gods have even finished being born, before the world has been shaped, before there is an earth or a sky for anything to happen on. In the great Babylonian poem of creation, in the very beginning, before anything else existed, there were the primordial waters and the salt waters. The deep and chaotic ocean out of which everything would come was a being, and that being was a serpent, or something very close to it. A vast primordial dragon of the deep called Tiamat. She was the first. She was the origin, the mother of everything, the chaos out of which the ordered world was made, and she was pictured as a great serpent dragon, coiled through the formless deep before the world began. And when the younger gods rose up and made war against her, when the champion of the gods went out to battle the primordial serpent of chaos, he did not merely kill her. He split her body in two, and from the two halves of the serpent's body he made the world. One half of her became the sky above, the other half became the earth below. The waters of the world flowed from her. Above all, the whole of ordered creation, the earth we stand on and the heaven above it, was formed, in the oldest telling, out of the divided body of the primordial serpent. Do you understand what that means for the place of the serpent on this list? It means the serpent is not just older than mankind. It is older than the world. For all that, it is the raw material out of which the world was made. It is woven into the very substance of the earth and the sky, because the earth and the sky are, in the oldest account, its body, split and shaped, and built into the structure of everything. The serpent is not a being that came into the world. The serpent is what the world was made from, and a being that is woven into the fabric of creation itself, that was present before the first god finished being born, and whose divided body became the ground beneath your feet and the sky over your head, is not something that can ever leave, because there is nowhere for it to leave to. It is already everywhere. It is already in everything. In truth, it was here before here existed, and it became here when here was made, and it has been here, in the deepest and most literal sense, ever since, because it is the thing that here is made of. The wisdom serpent of Mesopotamia, the one whose symbol marked the god Enki, was called by names that meant the great serpent, the mighty serpent dragon, and one of the most important of these serpent deities was a god of the underworld and of vegetation and of healing, pictured as a serpent or with serpents rising from his shoulders, a guardian of the threshold between the world of the living and the world below, a keeper of the secret knowledge of life and death and renewal. This serpent god stood at the doorways of the underworld. He guarded the boundary. He held the knowledge of how life passes into death and death back into life, the secret of the shedding skin, the mystery of renewal that the snake seemed to embody by casting off its old body and emerging new. And this is the same cluster of meaning we find everywhere the serpent appears. The serpent as the keeper of the threshold, the holder of the secret of life and death, the being that knows how to pass between the worlds and how to renew itself and never truly die. The Mesopotamians did not invent this. They inherited it from something older than their own civilization, and they passed it on to everyone who came after them, and the image has never lost its charge, because it points at the oldest and deepest of all the things this list has been circling, which is the difference between us and the ones who made us, the difference that comes down, in the end, to death. We die. They do not. And the serpent is the being that stands forever at the boundary between those two conditions, holding the secret of how to cross from the one to the other, offering, always offering, to share it. Walk the full circuit of the world and count the serpents, because the count is the argument, and no explanation of it is fully satisfying except the one the tablets suggest. On the brow of the rulers of the great river kingdom to the south, the serpent reared up, the sacred cobra rising from the forehead of the god-king, the guardian of royalty, the mark of a power that came from above and set its bearer apart from ordinary men. In the traditions of the peoples across the Western Ocean, in lands the ancient old world did not know existed, a great feathered serpent came down from the sky and taught mankind the calendar and the arts of civilization and the working of the fields, and then departed with a promise to return. And this serpent teacher from the heavens held the same place in their world that the fish sages held in Sumer, the bringer of knowledge from above. In the great traditions of the eastern subcontinent, serpent beings of immense wisdom and power guarded the deep places and the hidden treasures and the secret knowledge, moving between the human world and the realms below, keepers of the mysteries. Time and again, in the myths of the far north, a world serpent coiled around the entire earth, so vast that it encircled the whole of creation and grasped its own tail, holding the world in its coils until the end of all things. And everywhere, in the oldest layers of belief, there is the image of the serpent that grasps its own tail, the circle of the snake swallowing itself, the sign of eternity and of the endless cycle and of a thing that has no beginning and no end, which is precisely the sign a being would bear if it had been present before the world began and would remain after the world ended. The thread that runs through every one of these serpents is the same, and it is the thread that binds them to the wisdom god of Sumer and the serpent of the garden. It is knowledge. It is the threshold of the divine. By the same token, it is the secret of life and death and renewal, embodied in the creature that sheds its old skin and emerges new, the animal that seems, to every people that ever watched it, to renew its own life and cheat death by casting off its body and putting on another. The shedding of the skin is the key image, the visible sign of the serpent's deepest association, which is with immortality, with the renewal of life, with the one power that separates the gods from mankind, the power to slough off death and continue. The serpent seemed to hold that power in its very body, and so it became, in every land, the keeper of the secret of eternal life, the being that knew the thing mankind most wanted to know and was most forbidden to learn. And that is why it always appears at the same threshold, offering the same gift in every tradition, because the gift the serpent offers is always, at bottom, the same gift, the crossing of the boundary between the mortal and the divine, the knowledge that opens the eyes and the life that never ends, the two things the ruling beings kept for themselves and denied to the workforce they had made. But it was in the garden that the serpent did the thing that mattered most, the thing that defines it, the thing that makes it not merely the oldest being on this list, but the most important. And here we come to the deepest layer of the whole account, the place where all the threads we have been following draw together into a single knot. Because the story of the garden, the story of the first man and the first woman and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is not whatever you were taught, simply a story about disobedience. Read it again with the eyes this account has been trying to give you, and it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the founding story of the human race's relationship with the beings who made it, and the serpent is the center of it, and the serpent's role is the exact role we have seen the wisdom god play in Sumer, the giver of forbidden knowledge, the one who offers to lift the human race up toward the condition of the gods, in defiance of a higher god who wants mankind to remain in its place. Look carefully at what the serpent actually says in the garden, because every word of it matters. The first humans have been told by the god of the garden that they may eat from any tree except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that on the day they eat from it, they will surely die. And the serpent comes to the woman, and the serpent contradicts the god directly. "You will not surely die," the serpent says. And then it tells her why the god has really forbidden the fruit, and the reason it gives is not that the fruit is poison or that the tree is cursed. The reason it gives is that the god knows that on the day they eat of it, their eyes will be opened, and they will become like gods, knowing good and evil. That is the serpent's message. The god has lied to you about the danger. The truth is that this knowledge will make you like the gods, and that is the real reason it has been kept from you, because the ones above do not want you to rise to their level. Eat, and your eyes will open, and you will become like them. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that generations of readers have been carefully steered away from noticing, is that the serpent was telling the truth. The humans ate, and they did not die that day. Their eyes were opened, exactly as the serpent had promised. And the god of the garden, when he discovered what had happened, said something that confirms the serpent's account completely in the god's own words. Behold, the god said, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Like one of us. The god himself admits it. The knowledge the serpent gave to mankind did exactly what the serpent said it would do. It made the human race like the gods, knowing good and evil, having their eyes opened, crossing the boundary that had separated the made from the makers. The serpent did not deceive the first humans. The serpent enlightened them. It gave them the one thing that lifted them out of their designed condition of ignorance and toward the condition of the beings above. And the beings above were not grateful, and they were not pleased. They were alarmed. And what did the alarmed god do next? This is the detail that closes the circle, that ties the garden to Sumer with a knot that cannot be untied. And it is the same detail we found in the story of the sage who was offered the bread of life. Because the god of the garden, having discovered that mankind had gained the knowledge of good and evil and become like the gods, said that now there was only one thing left to prevent. Now, the god said, mankind must not be permitted to reach out and take also from the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. And for that reason, and the text states it as plainly as anything is stated anywhere, for that specific reason, to keep the human race away from the tree of life, the god drove the first humans out of the garden and set a guard at the entrance with a flaming sword, turning every way to block the path back to the tree of life forever. The expulsion from the garden was not a punishment for eating the fruit. Read the words. It was a preventive measure. It was done to stop mankind, now that it had gained the knowledge of the gods, from also gaining the immortality of the gods. The humans had crossed the first boundary, the boundary of knowledge, and become like the gods in that one respect. And the entire purpose of driving them out was to make sure they never crossed the second boundary, the boundary of eternal life, and became like the gods completely. Now set that beside the story of Enki and the sage, and watch them become the same story. A being associated with the serpent gives the human race forbidden knowledge that makes it like the gods. A higher god, threatened by this, moves specifically to deny the human race immortality, to keep the door to eternal life shut, to preserve the gap between mankind and the divine. In Sumer, the wisdom god, whose symbol is the serpent, enlightens mankind, and a warning about the bread of life keeps us mortal. In the garden, the serpent enlightens mankind, and a flaming sword at the tree of life keeps us mortal. It is one story. It is the same event, remembered by two peoples who lived side by side and drank from the same ancient well. And the being at the center of it, the serpent, the giver of the forbidden knowledge that made us like the gods, is the same being in both, the wisdom bringer, the enlightener, the one who stood at the threshold and beckoned the human race across it against the will of the ones who wanted us to stay in the dark. The ancient astronaut readers say it without flinching. Enki is the serpent of the garden. The wisdom god of Sumer and the serpent of Eden are one being, the benefactor and the deceiver, the one who lifted us up and the one who is blamed for it. And the two traditions are two halves of a single memory, split like the body of the primordial serpent, one half becoming the myth of Sumer and the other half becoming the story in the garden, and both halves describing the same ancient truth, which is that the knowledge that made us human was given to us deliberately by a serpent against the will of a higher power, and that the price of that gift was that we were driven out and kept mortal and set to labor, and never again allowed near the tree of life. And this is where the account turns, at last, to look directly at you. Because there is a reason the serpent is the being you were always going to recognize. The reason the promise made at the very beginning of this account was that by the time we reach the last of the 9, you would know it. You do know it. Of all the 9 beings on this list, the serpent is the one that everyone already knows. The one that was there in the oldest story you were ever told. Coiled around the tree in the picture books of your childhood, named in the first pages of the book that half the world keeps in its houses of worship, painted on the walls of the oldest temples and carved into the oldest seals. The serpent is not hidden in some forgotten tablet that only scholars can read. It is the most famous being in the entire religious memory of the human race. It is hiding, and it has always been hiding, in the most perfect hiding place of all, which is plain sight. You were told about it when you were a child. You were taught to fear it, to see it as the villain of the first story, the tempter, the deceiver, the bringer of the fall. And you were never told what it truly was, or where it truly came from, or that the same serpent coiled around the same tree and a dozen other traditions across a world your teachers said those ancient peoples could not have reached. You were shown the mask and told it was the whole being. And the being behind the mask, the oldest of the 9, the one that has been here since before the world was made, has been standing in the middle of your civilization's founding story the entire time, in plain view, recognized by everyone and understood by no one. That is why it ranks first. Not because it is the most powerful, though it may be. Not because it is the most active, because Enki was more active, and the ruling council governs more directly. It ranks first for the one reason this entire list was built to measure, which is time, which is how long it has been here. And the serpent has been here the longest of anything because it was here before the human race, before the ordered world, before the gods finished being born, coiled in the primordial deep, and it became the substance of the world when the world was made, and it came to the first humans at the very dawn of our existence, and gave us the knowledge that made us what we are. And it has appeared in the same shape, at the same threshold, offering the same gift in every tradition of every people, in every age since. It never left because it was never separate from us to begin with. Past that point, it is woven into the story of our making at the deepest level there is. It is the oldest disguise, the first thing that ever appeared to a human being as something other than what it was, the original of which every other hidden being on this list, the collectors and the fallen daughter and the night visitors and the seven and the bloodlines and the sages and the rulers and even Enki the maker, is a later and lesser echo. They are all the children of the serpent. Every hidden thing that has ever worn a human shape or moved unseen through the human world or offered forbidden knowledge at a dangerous threshold is descended in the logic of these traditions. From the first one, the oldest one, the one that was coiled at the root of the tree before there was anyone to coil for. And it is still there. It is still at the threshold. It is still offering the fruit. And it still, after all these thousands of years, wears the one disguise that has never once failed it, the disguise of a story so old and so familiar that no one thinks to ask what is truly hiding inside it. So there they are, the 9, ranged from the newest to the oldest, and now that we have climbed the whole of the ladder, it is worth standing back and looking at the shape of the thing entire, because the most important truth about these 9 beings is not any one of them by itself. It is the way they fit together. We counted them as if they were 9 separate entries on a list, 9 different creatures that happen to share the single trait of hiding in human form, and that is how the count had to proceed, one at a time, from the bottom up. But that is not what they are. Look at them all at once, from the collectors at the base to the serpent at the summit, and you do not see 9 separate things. You see one thing. You see a single structure, a hierarchy, a system, running from the top of the sky down through the ranks of the ruling beings and their agents and their bloodlines and their servants, all the way down to the officers who climb up out of the underworld to collect a marked life and climb back down again. It is one apparatus, and the human race is inside it. Trace the connections one more time, because they are the whole point, and they were there in every entry if you were watching for them. The collectors at the bottom, the Gallu, do not act on their own. They are officers dispatched carrying out sentences. And the sentences come from the tribunal of the underworld, the judges of the dead. And the judges of the dead bear the same name as the ruling council of heaven, because they are the same order of being, the Anunnaki, governing the human race in death exactly as they govern it in life. The fallen daughter who preys on the cradle was cast down from among those same ruling beings, an Anunnaki by blood, thrown out, but never truly separate. The 7 who bring down cities were manufactured by the highest of the ruling beings and held in reserve as weapons of that same order. Just as clearly, the bloodlines that carry the inheritance of the sky beings, the Agigi, and the sages run back to the same council and its members, and above all to the one member who made mankind with his own hands. And that one member, Enki, the maker, wore the shape of the serpent, and the serpent is the oldest of them all, the origin, the first, the one from which every other hidden thing descends. Pull on any thread in this whole tapestry and it leads to the same place. Pull on the collector at the bottom, and you are led up through the tribunal, to the ruling council, to the maker, to the serpent at the top. They are not 9 beings. They are 9 points on a single structure that reaches from the primordial deep to the doorway of your house, and every point on it is connected to every other. And the whole of it was built around one purpose, and the purpose was us. What is the purpose? Strip away every mythic robe and every divine name and ask the plainest possible question. What was the whole apparatus for? And the tablets, read from the bottom to the top, give an answer that is remarkably consistent, and it is the answer that ought to disturb you most, because it is not a story about gods who loved their creation. It is a story about management. The human race was made to work. That is the origin, stated flatly in the oldest account we possess. The clay and the divine blood, mixed to produce a laborer, to replace the gods who would no longer labor. We were built as a workforce. And every one of the 9 beings, from the highest to the lowest, plays a role in the management of that workforce. The ruling council governs it and sets it to its tasks. The Maker designed it and keeps it alive and in its place, neither destroying it nor allowing it to rise. Once again, the 7 are held in reserve to reduce it when it grows too numerous. The fallen daughter thins it at the cradle. The collectors gather it in at the end and carry it down to the tribunal that judges it. In turn, the bloodlines rule it from within, the mighty men and the half-divine sages installed at the top of the human order to keep it running on behalf of the ones above. It is a complete system for the creation, the governance, the maintenance, the population control, and the final disposition of a workforce. And the workforce is the human race, and it has been running, according to the oldest writing on Earth, since before recorded history began. And notice the single thread that runs through the whole of it, the one desire that the ruling beings return to again and again in tablet after tablet, because it is the key to understanding why they hide, and why they have never left, and what they most want to prevent. It is control of our numbers, and above that, control of our nature. Over and over, the trouble in these stories begins the same way. Mankind multiplies, the workforce grows. It becomes numerous, and it becomes loud, and its growth and its noise rise up and disturb the ones above. And over, the response is not joy at the flourishing of the creation, but a move to reduce it. A plague, a drought, a famine, a flood, the loosing of the 7, the fallen daughter at the cradle. The ruling beings want a workforce, but they want a manageable one, a controlled one, a population kept within limits, and they have reached, repeatedly, for the means to keep it there. And beneath even the concern with numbers lies the deeper concern, the one that the garden and the story of the sage both point to, which is the concern with what we might become. Because the one thing the ruling beings moved most decisively to prevent, the one boundary they guarded with a flaming sword and a deadly warning, was not our numbers but our nature. They would let us live. They would let us multiply within limits. But they would not let us become like them. They would not let us have the knowledge that made us their equals. And when we got it anyway, from the serpent, they made certain we would never have the immortality that would have completed the transformation. They kept us mortal. Beyond that, they kept us dying. They kept us in the one condition that guaranteed we could always be ruled, because a being that dies can always be replaced, and a being that fears death can always be governed, and a being that never accumulates more than a single short lifetime of knowledge can never rise high enough to threaten the ones who made it. The whole apparatus, in the end, exists to keep the human race exactly where it was designed to be, alive enough to work, numerous enough to be useful, but never immortal, never fully awake, never allowed to close the gap between the made and the makers. That is why they hide. Ask it directly. Why would beings that once ruled openly, from the tops of the great temples, fed and served by the whole population, why would they withdraw into invisibility and stay there for thousands of years? And the answer that the structure itself suggests is that hiding is simply the most efficient way to run the system now that the system is mature. In the beginning, the ruling beings had to be present, had to appear, had to establish the whole apparatus by hand. And so they lived at the top of the visible mountain, and everyone knew they were there. But once the apparatus was built, once the institution of kingship was installed, and the bloodlines were seated, and the whole self-perpetuating structure of human civilization was up and running, the ruling beings no longer needed to be visible to keep it going. It ran on its own. The kings ruled in their name without needing to see them. The priesthoods interpreted their will without needing them to speak. More than that, the workforce labored and multiplied, and died, and was replaced, generation after generation, inside a structure that no longer required its builders to show their faces, because the structure had become the way the human world simply was, mistaken by its inhabitants for the natural order of things. And a ruling power that has reached that stage, where its control is so deeply built into the assumptions of the governed that the governed cannot even see it as control, does not benefit from being visible. It benefits from being invisible, from being unsuspected, from being so far in the background that no one even looks for it. Visibility invites challenge. Invisibility invites nothing, because you cannot challenge what you cannot see, and you cannot even want to challenge what you do not know is there. The ruling beings hid because hiding is how you hold power that is already total. They did not withdraw because they were defeated. They withdrew because they had won so completely that they no longer needed to be seen to keep winning. And this is the point at which the whole of this account presses closest to the world you actually live in, and it is the point where I want to be most careful, because this is exactly where the temptation is greatest to say too much, to start naming names, to start pointing at particular people and particular institutions and declaring them the hidden hand. That is a road that leads only to foolishness and to cruelty, and the tablets do not require us to walk it. What the tablets require is something quieter and, in its way, far more unsettling, because it does not let you off the hook by giving you a villain you can point at. The tablets simply describe a system, an ancient and self-perpetuating structure for the governance of a workforce, built around the concentration of power in the hands of a hidden few, sustained by keeping the many in a condition of limitation and dependence and unawareness, and designed above all to prevent the workforce from ever waking up to what it truly is, and what it might truly become. And then the tablets fall silent, and leave you to look at the world around you, and to notice, if you dare, how much of what they described is still standing. Not who runs it. That is the wrong question, the question that leads to madness. But whether the shape of it is still here? Whether the pattern the oldest civilization on Earth described, the pattern of the many governed by the hidden few, of a population kept in its place and prevented from rising, of a structure so old and so deep that its inhabitants mistake it for the natural order and cannot see it as a structure at all, whether that pattern is still the pattern we live inside. The tablets do not answer that. They only make it impossible, once you have read them, to stop asking. And yet the tablets do not leave us entirely without a weapon, and it is worth ending on the weapon, because it is the one hopeful thing in this whole long and shadowed account, and it has been sitting quietly in the background of every single entry on this list. Think back over the 9, and notice what the ancients did. In every case, when they were faced with one of these hidden beings, they named it. That was the response, over and over, in tablet after tablet, in the incantation series and the protective texts and the rituals of the priests. When the fallen daughter came to the cradle in the shape of a helping woman, the priest recited her true name and her true lineage and her true form, out loud, in front of the household, and by naming her he stripped the disguise away and drove her back. When the night visitor came in the shape of desire, the exorcist named it for what it was, a hunger of the night wind wearing a borrowed face, and the naming broke its hold. By the same measure, when the collectors and the seven and all the rest pressed in upon the human world, the one thing the ancients had, the one power they could wield against beings that were stronger and older and more hidden than themselves, was the power to know them and to name them. And they treated that power with deadly seriousness, because they understood something about these beings that we have almost entirely forgotten. They understood that a thing which hides in human form depends, wholly and completely, on not being recognized. Its entire strategy is the disguise. Its whole power is that you do not know what it is. And the instant you do know, the instant you can look at the helping woman and see the fallen daughter, look at the perfect lover and see the night hunger, look at the familiar story and see the oldest serpent, the disguise begins to fail, because a disguise that has been seen through is no disguise at all. This is why the ancients wrote everything down. This is why they pressed the descriptions and the names and the true forms into clay and baked it hard and stored it in the libraries of their temples. They were not recording superstition for its own sake. They were building a weapon, and the weapon was knowledge, and the knowledge was recognition, and they were passing it down the generations so that their descendants would not be caught defenseless, would not welcome the helper into the birthing room, or the lover into the bed, or the stranger into the house, without knowing what might be wearing those shapes. The whole vast literature of Mesopotamian protective magic is, at its heart, a manual of recognition, a field guide to the hidden beings, compiled by a people who had learned, at terrible cost, that the only defense against a thing that pretends to be human is to know it well enough to see through the pretense. And they left that manual for us. It survived the fires that burned their cities. It survived the burial of thousands of years. Here too, it came back into the light in our own age, dug out of the mounds of Iraq, translated word by patient word, and now it sits in the museums and the scholarly editions, the oldest field guide in the world, waiting for anyone willing to read it and learn to see. Because the beings themselves, if the tablets are right, never went anywhere. That is the hard truth at the center of this whole account, the truth we have circled from the very first words. The age of open rule ended, but the beings did not leave. They changed their method. They put on our shape and stepped down off the mountain and into the crowd, and they have been here ever since. All 9 ranks of them. From the collectors who arrive even now to seize a marked life, to the serpent that has been here since before the world was made. For that reason, they are not a story about the past. They are, in the logic of the tablets, a description of the present, an account of a world that is still crowded with hidden things wearing borrowed faces, still governed by a structure whose builders never showed themselves, still watched over by the Maker who tends his creation from just behind the veil. And the only reason we do not see them, the only reason we walk through our days as if the world were empty of everything but ourselves, is that we have lost the field guide. We have forgotten how to recognize them. We were handed the oldest knowledge on earth, the hard-won wisdom of the first civilization about the things that hide in human form, and we set it aside as myth, as poetry, as the quaint imaginings of a young and frightened people, and in setting it aside, we disarmed ourselves. In the same way, we took the one weapon our ancestors left us, the weapon of recognition, and we put it in a museum and stopped believing it was a weapon at all. What would it mean to pick it up again? Not to descend into fear, because fear is its own kind of blindness, and a person who sees a monster in every stranger has become as useless to themselves as a person who sees nothing at all. The ancients did not live in constant terror. They lived with knowledge, which is a different thing. They knew the signs. Even so, they knew what to watch for. They knew that most strangers are only strangers, that most helpers are only helpers, that most of the faces in the crowd are exactly what they appear to be, and that the hidden ones are rare and specific and recognizable if you know the pattern. To pick up the field guide again is not to become afraid, it is to become awake. It is to move through the world with the old knowledge quietly present at the back of the mind, to notice the helper who arrives too conveniently and knows too much, the stranger who falls into step beside you and asks for you by name, the presence in the night that leaves you weaker every dawn, the familiar story that has been sitting in plain sight since your childhood with something ancient coiled inside it. What is more, it is to know, as the ancients knew, that the world is not empty, that it is older and stranger and more crowded than we have been taught, and that the things which share it with us survive by not being seen. And it is to understand that the simple act of seeing them, of recognizing what they are, of naming them in the old way, is the one power we have always held over them, the power that made them hide in the first place, the power they most need us to forget we possess. For consider why the knowledge was almost lost, because that too is part of the story, and it is not an innocent part. The tablets tell us that one of the things the ruling beings most wanted was to keep the human race unaware, kept in its designed condition of limitation and dependence, prevented from waking up to what it truly is. And there is no knowledge more dangerous to a hidden power than the knowledge of its own existence. A workforce that does not know it is a workforce is easy to manage. A population that mistakes the structure it lives inside for the natural order of the world will never think to question it, never think to look behind the curtain, never think to pick up the ancient field guide and start recognizing the things that move through its world unseen. The single most valuable thing to a system built on hiding is that its subjects should not believe the hiding things are real. And so it is worth asking, as the ancient astronaut readers do ask, why exactly this knowledge, of all the knowledge of the ancient world, was so thoroughly reclassified as myth, why the first civilization's detailed and serious account of the beings that hide among us was set aside so completely, why we were all taught, so uniformly and so early, that the serpent in the oldest story was just a symbol, and the gods of Sumer were just the poetry of a primitive people, and the whole vast literature of recognition was nothing but superstition, to be studied by specialists and believed by no one. Perhaps that is simply what happens to old knowledge as the world moves on. Or perhaps, as the readers suggest, the forgetting served someone. Perhaps a structure built on not being seen has an interest in making sure the field guide to seeing it is dismissed and buried and disbelieved. Perhaps the reason we no longer recognize the hidden ones is not an accident of history, but the single greatest achievement of the hidden ones themselves, who have arranged, over the long, slow centuries, that the one weapon capable of exposing them should be the one piece of ancient knowledge that everyone agrees to treat as a fairy tale. So come back, at the end, to where we began, to the table, and the stranger, and the face that looks right. We opened with the image of a person sitting across from something that is not human and having no idea, and it may have seemed, at the start, like the opening of a ghost story, a bit of atmosphere to draw you in. It should not seem that way now. Now, Having climbed the whole ladder of the nine, having seen how the collectors connect to the tribunal and the tribunal to the ruling council and the council to the maker and the maker to the serpent, having seen that the disguise is not the exception but the very foundation of the whole structure, that image at the table should read differently. Because if even a fraction of what the oldest civilization on Earth wrote down is true, then that image is not a ghost story at all. It is a description of an ordinary Tuesday. It is a description of the world as it has been since before the world was made. A world in which the things that share our streets and our houses and our stories are older and stranger than we have allowed ourselves to believe, and in which the surest sign of one of them is not a monstrous form or a glowing eye, but the simple, unremarkable, perfectly convincing appearance of being one of us. And the deepest turn of all, the one the whole account was built to deliver, is the recognition that you were promised at the very beginning, and it is not the recognition of a monster. It is the recognition of yourself and of your own oldest story. Because the being that has been here the longest, the first of the nine, the serpent at the summit of the whole structure, is not hidden in some obscure tablet that only a scholar could find. It is in the first pages of the book that shaped the civilization you were born into. It is coiled around the tree in the picture you were shown before you could read. You were told about the oldest of these beings when you were a child, and you were told to fear it, and you were never once told what it truly was, or how old it truly was, or that it appears in the same shape, at the same threshold, in the traditions of peoples who could never have spoken to one another. The oldest and most powerful of all the hidden beings has spent its entire existence hiding in the one place no one ever searches, which is the story everyone already knows, and that is the recognition. That is the thing that was supposed to make the hair rise on your arms by the time we reach the end. Not that there are monsters you have never heard of, but that the monster you heard of first, the one from the very beginning, the serpent in the garden, is the oldest and the realest and the least understood of them all, and it has been standing in plain sight in the middle of your civilization's founding story for as long as there has been a civilization to found, and you looked right at it every time and never saw what was there. Once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it, and that is both the gift and the burden of picking the old field guide back up. The world does not look the same afterward. The familiar stories do not read the same. On top of this, the serpent coiled around the staff of the healers, the serpent reared on the brow of the ancient kings, the feathered serpent descending from the sky to teach, the serpent at the root of the world tree, the serpent in the garden, offering the fruit that opens the eyes. All of these stop being a scatter of unrelated old images, and resolve into a single figure appearing again and again across the whole of human memory, the same being at the same threshold offering the same forbidden gift. And once you have seen that the figure is one figure, you cannot go back to seeing it as many. The helper who arrives too conveniently, the stranger who knows your name, the presence in the night, the seven who come before the fall, the bloodlines that guard themselves so jealously, the whole structure of power that no one built and everyone obeys. All of it takes on a different weight once you are carrying the old knowledge, and you understand, as the ancients understood, that you are not moving through an empty world, but through a crowded and ancient one, older than your teachers admitted, stranger than your instruments can measure, full of things that survive by not being seen. But hold on to the other half of it too, the half that keeps this knowledge from becoming a kind of madness, because the ancients held on to it, and so must we. They did not see a monster in every stranger. They knew that the hidden ones are rare, and that the disguise, though total, is worn by few, and that the overwhelming majority of the faces in the crowd are exactly what they appear to be, ordinary human beings living ordinary human lives, as real and as mortal and as unremarkable as you are. The knowledge the ancients left us is not a knowledge that poisons the world and turns every neighbor into a suspect. It is a knowledge that wakes you up to the possibility, that keeps the old awareness quietly present at the back of the mind, that lets you notice the rare wrong note in the vast ordinary music of human life. The point was never to be afraid of everyone. The point was to be able to recognize the one, when the one appears, as your ancestors could recognize it by knowing the signs, by knowing the pattern, by knowing the true names and the true shapes that the oldest writing on earth took such care to record. Fear blinds, knowledge sees. And what the tablets offer, to anyone willing to take them seriously, is not fear but sight, the recovered ability to look at the world the way the first civilization looked at it, with open eyes, in full knowledge that the world is not what we have been told, and that the things which hide in it can, with the right knowledge, be seen. The clay that carried all of this to us was never meant to reach us. Think about that, at the last, because it is a small miracle and it changes how you should hold everything you have heard. The scribes who pressed these accounts into wet tablets were writing for their own world, for their own kings and priests and temples, in a language they had every reason to believe would last forever, because it had already lasted longer than they could imagine. They did not write for you. They could not have conceived of you. A person in a world they had no words for, receiving their warnings across a gulf of thousands of years. And yet the tablets survived. And the reason they survived is itself a dark kind of poetry, because they survived by fire. The great libraries of the ancient world, the collections where these accounts were stored, were burned when the cities fell. And the burning that destroyed the buildings and the wooden shelves and everything soft and perishable did the one thing that could preserve the clay, which was to bake it hard, to fire the tablets like pottery in a kiln, so that the very catastrophe that ended those civilizations is the reason their deepest secrets came down to us intact. The knowledge of the hidden ones was saved by the destruction of the ones who wrote it. It passed through fire and through burial and through the long forgetting, and it came back into the light in our own age. And now it is here, in front of you, the oldest field guide in the world, warning you about the things that the first human beings learned to fear. And so the question that remains is not really a question about them. It is a question about you, about what you will do with the old knowledge now that it has, against all odds, reached you. You can set it back down where you found it, and file it under myth, and return to the comfortable and empty world where nothing shares the streets with us but ourselves, and that is the easier path, and most people will take it. And the tablets predicted that too, that the workforce would prefer not to know, that the disguise works best on those who do not want to see through it. Or you can carry it. You can move through your days with the old awareness quietly present, not afraid, but awake, knowing the signs the way your most ancient ancestors knew them, understanding that the world is older and stranger and more crowded than you were taught, and that the surest disguise any being ever wore is the ordinary human face, and the surest hiding place any power ever found is a story so familiar that no one thinks to look inside it. The next time a stranger falls into step beside you and seems to know a little more than a stranger should, they are almost certainly only a stranger. The next time a helper arrives at exactly the right moment, wearing exactly the right kindness, they are almost certainly only a helper. Above all, the next time you find yourself weakened after a night you cannot quite remember, it was almost certainly only a dream. Almost. That is the word the tablets leave you with. The small and stubborn word that will not go away once you have let it in. Almost. Because the ancients, who were not fools, who built the first cities, and wrote the first words and mapped the first stars, did not spend their centuries carving warnings about nothing. They carved them about something. They saw something, and they named it, and they left the names for us. And the names are waiting. And the things the names describe are, if the oldest writing on earth is telling the truth, still here, still wearing our shape, still moving through the world they ruled before we were made, and hidden when their open rule was done. 9 of them we have counted, from the newest to the oldest, from the collectors who arrive even now to the serpent that was here before the world. 9 ranks of a single structure that reaches from the primordial deep to the doorway of your house. And the oldest of them, the first, the one that has been here the longest, is the one you knew before you knew anything at all, coiled at the root of the first story you were ever told, offering the fruit, whispering that your eyes will be opened, that you will not surely die, that you will become like the gods. It told the truth once, at the beginning, and the beings above it drove us out of the garden and shut the gate to keep the truth from finishing its work. And it is still there. It has always been there. It is at the threshold still, in the oldest story and in the newest night, holding out the same fruit it held out to the first man and the first woman, and the only thing that has changed in all the thousands of years between them and you is that we have forgotten how to see it. The ancients could see it. They wrote down how. And now, at the end of this, so can you. That is the whole of what they left us, not fear, sight. The oldest sight there is, recovered from the fire and the dark, handed forward across the ruin of every civilization that ever held it, into your hands, tonight. Look with it, and do not look away.